The November wind carried a bite that had nothing to do with winter and everything to do with the kind of cold that settled into bones and stayed. Thomas Wade felt it through his coat, through the layers of worn cotton and leather that had seen him through 5 years of solitude on this godforsaken stretch of high desert. His horse moved beneath him with the resigned patience of an animal that understood its rider's moods, picking through the dry grass and scattered stone without needing direction. Tom was 38, though the gray at his temples made strangers guess older. The sun had weathered his face into something harder than it used to be, back when he wore a badge and believed the law meant something beyond the men who twisted it to their needs. He kept his dark hair short because long hair got in the way of work, and work was all that kept the memories at bay. The scars on his knuckles told stories he never shared, and the empty cabin, waiting at the end of this ride, held no one who would ask. The fence line stretched ahead, sagging in places where winter freeze had buckled the posts. Tom had been riding since dawn, checking for breaks, looking for strays, doing the kind of mindless labor that let a man exist without thinking too hard about why. His cattle were few, his ambitions smaller. After what happened in Silver Creek, after Sarah, after the trial that wasn't, after everything burned down around him, Tom had learned that wanting less hurt less. He noticed the wrongness before he understood what it was. Something about the fence near the front yard, the way it bowed under weight it wasn't meant to carry. Tom's hand moved to the Colt at his hip, not from fear, but from instinct carved into muscle memory by years of walking into trouble. He'd seen too many ambushes disguised as distress, too many traps baited with the appearance of helplessness. But when he dismounted and walked closer, boots crunching through frost-brittle grass, Tom saw that this wasn't an ambush. This was something worse. A woman hung from his fence wrist, chained to the top rail, her body slumped forward in a way that made Tom's chest tighten with a rage he thought he'd buried years ago. Her skin was bronze, darkened further by exposure and cold. Long black hair tangled with leather strips and worn beads fell across her face, hiding her features. She wore clothes that had once been whole, a long skirt torn at the hem, a shirt that might have been white before dirt and blood stained it, the color of old leather. The chains were crude but effective, thick iron links looped through rusted cuffs that had scraped her wrists raw. Dried blood crusted the metal and stained her hands, evidence of hours spent fighting restraints that wouldn't yield. Her fingers twitched, occasionally small spasms that told Tom she was alive, barely but alive nonetheless. He stopped 10 feet away, scanning the yard with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned not to trust obvious scenes. No fresh tracks beyond his own, no movement in the brush line or along the ridge that rose behind his property. The wind pushed dust across open ground, erasing whatever trail had brought her here. Whoever had chained this woman to his fence had done it carefully, had planned it, had known exactly what they were doing and why. Tom's jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. He'd seen this before, not here, but in other places, other times. Men who treated women like property, like things to be used and discarded when they stopped being useful. Men who thought chains and fear were acceptable tools for control. He'd killed men like that back when killing in service of justice seemed like something noble instead of just another form of violence. The woman lifted her head as he approached, the movement slow and painful. Her eyes were dark red-rimmed from wind and exhaustion, and something deeper, a fear that went beyond the immediate danger of exposure and starvation. When she saw him, her entire body tensed, shoulders pulling back against the fence rail, preparing for whatever came next. Tom kept his hands visible, movements deliberate and slow. He'd learned this too, how to approach broken things without making them break further. His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by disuse, and the anger climbing up his throat. "I'm not here to hurt you." The words hung in the cold air between them. She didn't respond, didn't relax. If anything, she pulled tighter into herself, waiting for the lie to reveal itself the way lies always did. Tom understood. Trust wasn't something you could ask for. It was something you earned piece by piece through actions that matched words. He crouched down, not close enough to touch, but near enough that she could see his face clearly, could read whatever truth existed there to him. "You've been out here a while." Not a question, just acknowledgement. Her lips moved, cracked in dry, shaping words that barely carried sound. "Do whatever you want." The resignation in her voice hit Tom harder than he expected. This wasn't fear of him specifically. This was the kind of exhaustion that came from expecting the worst so many times that hope became a luxury you couldn't afford. Just don't let me die out here. Tom felt something shift in his chest, a familiar weight settling in. He'd made a promise once, years ago, to a woman he couldn't save. That failure had followed him across 3 states and 5 years of trying to forget. He couldn't save Sarah, couldn't stop the men who'd killed her or the system that protected them afterward. But he could save this woman here now on his own land, where the only law that mattered was the one he chose to enforce. He shifted his focus to the chains, studying the lock mechanism with the kind of attention that came from years of dealing with restraints. The metal was old, rusted at the edges where moisture had eaten through protective coatings. Whoever had secured her here had done it quickly, more concerned with speed than security. The lock wasn't closed properly, hanging loose in the hasp, with only the chain's weight keeping it in place. She flinched when his hand moved toward the restraints, a full-body jerk that spoke to conditioning, to learned responses carved into nervous system through repetition and pain. Tom paused, giving her time to see that his intention wasn't to grab, but to free. His fingers were steady, even though his thoughts weren't, even though every second looking at those chains made him think of Sarah's bruised wrists, of the coroner's report he'd read, until the words blurred together into meaningless shapes. The lock clicked open, easier than expected. Tom had carried a thin pick in his coat pocket for years, useful for fence repairs and broken latches, and apparently for freeing women from chains. The metal separated with a sound like breaking teeth, and suddenly the weight was gone, the chains falling to the ground with a heavy thud that seemed to echo across the empty yard. She collapsed forward immediately, arms folding toward her chest in a protective curl. Her breathing changed, became something closer to sobs than relief, the kind of crying that came from a place too deep for tears. Tom stepped back fast, putting distance between them so she wouldn't think he expected something in return for basic humanity. He walked to the cabin, moving with purpose but not haste. Inside, the space was sparse, a single room with a stove, a cot, a table, shelves holding supplies organized with military precision. Tom grabbed a wool blanket from the trunk near his bedroll and filled a tin cup with water from the barrel he kept by the door. When he returned, she hadn't moved, still folded over herself, still processing the absence of chains like someone who didn't quite believe in freedom yet. Tom set the blanket and cup on the ground in front of her, then stepped back again. No forcing, no insistence. Just an offer that she could accept or refuse on her own terms. He'd learned this too, that the worst thing you could do to someone who'd lost autonomy was to take away their choices, even choices as simple as whether to accept help. She stared at the blanket for a long time, her gaze moving between the fabric and Tom's face, as if trying to decode what kind of trap this was. When she finally reached out, her hands shook badly enough that the cup trembled, water sloshing against the rim. She drank in small sips, her body remembering hydration, even if her mind was still caught in survival mode. The blanket came next, pulled around her shoulders with the careful movements of someone expecting it to be yanked away at any moment. She tucked the edges under her arms, creating a barrier between herself and the world, between herself and him. Tom waited until she looked up again before speaking. "You can come and dine if you need warmth. No obligations. Just shelter." The words felt inadequate, couldn't possibly convey the complexity of what he was offering or why. How did you explain to someone who'd been chained to a fence that you weren't like the men who put her there? You couldn't. You just had to prove it, action by action, choice by choice, until the pattern became clear enough to trust. She studied him with an intensity that felt like being weighed and measured. Tom held still under the scrutiny, understanding that this moment mattered, that whatever she decided now would set the tone for everything that followed. He wanted to tell her about Sarah, about how he understood what it meant to be failed by men who were supposed to protect, about how that failure had driven him to this empty land where the only person he could fail was himself. But those weren't his stories to share, not yet, not when she had her own trauma to carry. Finally, slowly she rose, her legs nearly buckled, knees giving out before she caught herself against the fence rail. Tom tensed, ready to help, but not moving, letting her maintain whatever dignity she could salvage from this situation. She took 3 shaky steps toward the cabin, each one looking like it cost more than it should, like her body was running on fumes and determination and nothing else. When she reached the porch steps, she paused again, looking at the open door with suspicion. Tom understood. Every doorway was a potential trap, Every offered kindness could be a prelude to worse cruelty. You did chain to a stranger's fence by trusting easily. He moved past her into the cabin first, leaving the doorway clear so she wouldn't feel cornered. Inside, lamplight cast warm shadows across wooden walls. The stove radiated heat, filling the small space with a comfort that felt almost aggressive after hours of exposure. Tom gestured toward the chair near the table, the one with the cushion he'd made from scrap fabric and patience. Sit if you can. I'll get supplies for those wrists. She didn't sit immediately. Instead, she stood just inside the doorway, taking in the space with the kind of attention that came from needing to know all exits, all potential weapons, all ways this could go wrong. Tom let her look, let her catalog the Spartan interior, the absence of excessive anything. He'd built this life to be simple, uncomplicated by possessions or connections, a place where nothing could be taken away because there was nothing worth taking. When she finally moved toward the chair, it was with the careful steps of someone navigating enemy territory. She lowered herself onto the seat like she expected it to disappear, her body rigid with tension that wouldn't ease just because chains had been removed. Tom heated water on the stove, the routine familiar and grounding. He pulled clean cloth strips from a wooden crate supplies he kept for inevitable injuries that came with ranch work. He set everything on the table near her, making each movement visible, predictable, unthreatening. She watched his hands constantly tracking every gesture, as if his fingers might suddenly transform into weapons. I need to clean those wounds. Only if you let me. The words came out gentler than he'd intended, softened by something he didn't want to examine too closely. She looked at her wrists, at the raw flesh and dried blood, at damage that would scar, regardless of treatment. Then she looked at him, really looked, trying to see past his weathered face and gray-shot hair to whatever truth existed beneath. Her nod was barely perceptible, more exhaustion than agreement, but Tom took it. He pulled a second chair close, not directly in front of her, but offset enough that she wouldn't feel boxed in. When he reached for her hands, he moved slowly, telegraphing every motion, giving her time to pull away if she needed to. Her skin was cold, despite the blanket chilled through from hours of exposure. The chains had bitten deep, breaking skin in multiple places where she'd pulled against restraints that wouldn't yield. Infection hadn't set in yet, but it would if these wounds weren't properly treated. Tom cleaned each wrist with careful attention, his touch as light as he could manage, while still being effective. She winced but didn't pull away, didn't make a sound beyond sharp intakes of breath when the water touched damaged flesh. Tom worked in silence, focusing on the medical necessity rather than the rage building in his chest. Someone had done this deliberately, had chained her with the specific intention of causing pain, of breaking something inside her that had nothing to do with bones or skin. When he wrapped the bandages, he made sure they were tight enough to protect, but loose enough not to feel like new restraints. He secured the ends with small knots, then released her hands immediately, not lingering, not expecting gratitude or recognition. You'll stay here tonight. Rest. No one will bother you. The promise felt too big, encompassing more than just this night, this cabin, this moment. Tom wasn't good at promises anymore, had learned through bitter experience that good intentions didn't prevent bad outcomes. But something about this situation, about finding her chained to his fence like an offering or a challenge or a test, made him speak with certainty he didn't quite feel. She didn't argue, didn't thank him, didn't do anything except pull the blanket tighter around herself. Tom gave her the cot, the only real bed in the cabin, and laid his bedroll on the floor against the far wall. He wasn't tired yet, too much adrenaline still coursing through his system, too many questions circling in his mind like vultures over carrion. Who had chained her? Why his fence specifically? Were they watching now, waiting to see what he'd do? And most importantly, would they come back? Tom settled onto his bedroll, positioning himself between her and the door, a barrier that was more symbolic than practical, but felt necessary nonetheless. He pretended to sleep, closing his eyes and evening his breathing, giving her permission to lower her guard by lowering his own. But his hands stayed close to the Colt, and his ears tracked every sound, the crackle of the stove, the whisper of wind through cracks in the walls, her breathing as it gradually slowed from panicked to merely cautious. He opened his eyes periodically, checking to make sure she was still breathing, still present, still real, and not some fever dream conjured by too much isolation and too many regrets. Each time he looked, she was watching him back, her dark eyes catching lamplight, unblinking and wary. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken things, her fear, his anger, the questions neither was ready to ask or answer. Outside, the night deepened cold, pressing against the cabin walls like something alive and hungry. Inside, two strangers who'd become reluctant allies through circumstance rather than choice waited for dawn, for answers, for whatever came next. Tom thought about Sarah again, about how he'd failed to protect her when it mattered most, about how the men who killed her had walked free because the sheriff was their cousin, because the judge played poker with the Hare father, because the system that was supposed to deliver justice had been built by the same kind of men who put chains on women and called it order. He'd left Silver Creek after the trial that wasn't after months of watching guilty men smile and wave from courthouse steps while Sarah's grave gathered weeds. He'd ridden west with no destination beyond the way he had found this land by accident or fate, or the simple intersection of exhaustion and available property. For 5 years he'd lived here alone, had built a life measured in fence posts and cattle and sunrises that meant nothing beyond the passage of time. But finding this woman chained to his fence changed something, reopened wounds he'd thought were scarred over. It reminded him that there were still men in the world who treated women like property, who used chains and fear to maintain control, who believed their power made them untouchable. Tom had walked away from that fight once, had chosen solitude over struggle, because fighting seemed futile when the system protected the guilty. But apparently the fight had found him anyway, had appeared on his land in the form of a woman whose name he didn't know, in a situation he couldn't ignore. He watched her finally close her eyes, exhaustion winning over vigilance. Her breathing evened out, became the deep rhythm of sleep born from complete physical depletion. Only then did Tom let himself truly relax, muscles unclenching from readiness, mind slowing its constant threat assessment. Tomorrow would bring questions that needed answers. Tonight was just about survival, about keeping watch while someone who'd been hunted finally got to rest without fear. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness for his failure to save Sarah. But maybe it was a start. The lamplight guttered low, casting long shadows across wooden walls. Outside, something moved in the darkness, an animal wind through brush, nothing that required investigation. Tom stayed still, a sentinel between her and whatever dangers waited beyond his cabin walls, and for the first time in 5 years, his solitude felt less like punishment and more like preparation for this moment. Dawn arrived with the kind of light that made everything sharp-edged and unforgiving. Tom rose from his bedroll before the sun cleared the ridge, moving quietly to avoid disturbing her sleep. She was still curled on the cot, blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, hair falling across her face in tangled curtains. In sleep without fear, tightening her features, Tom could see that she was younger than he'd initially thought, maybe mid-20s, though hardship aged people in ways that had nothing to do with years. He stepped outside into cold that bit through his coat, the kind of November chill that promised early winter. The sky was clear pale blue, stretching from horizon to horizon without a cloud to break its expanse. Tom's breath fogged in the air as he surveyed his property with the methodical attention that had become ritual. The fence where he'd found her yesterday looked ordinary, now chains gone, no visible evidence of what had happened. But Tom could see where the wood had been marked, where links had pressed into weathered boards, leaving shallow indentations like branded scars. He walked the perimeter, studying the ground for tracks, for any sign of who had brought her here. The trail was faint, already half erased by wind and time. 2 horses, maybe 3, had approached from the ridge to the north. They'd stopped long enough to secure her to the fence, then had ridden away in the same direction. No hurry, no panic, just methodical execution of a plan that had been thought through in advance. Tom crouched near the clearest print, measuring its depth and shape with experienced eyes. Heavy rider, military-style boots, horse that had been recently shod. Professional, or at least someone who took care of their equipment. Not random drifters or opportunistic criminals, but men with resources and planning. The realization settled in his chest like a cold stone. This wasn't a crime of passion or convenience. Someone had deliberately chosen his fence, his land, his isolated location. They'd known he lived alone out here, had probably watched long enough to learn his patterns. The question was why. What did they gain by leaving a chained woman on his property? Several possibilities occurred to him, none of them comforting. Maybe they wanted to implicate him in whatever had happened to her. Maybe they expected him to do exactly what most men would do, use her, hurt her, dispose of her, become another link in a chain of violence. Or maybe they were testing him, measuring his response, seeing if he was the kind of man who would report to authorities or handle things himself. Tom straightened joints, protesting the cold and the hard floor he'd slept on. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a soft creak. She stood in the doorway, blankets still wrapped around her shoulders, watching him with the same wariness she'd shown last night. But there was something different in her posture this morning, a fraction less fear, or maybe just exhaustion displacing vigilance. He walked back toward the cabin, keeping his movements slow and predictable. Her eyes tracked him the entire distance, ready to bolt despite having nowhere to go. Found tracks from the North Ridge, 2, maybe 3 riders. They didn't try to hide their trail. His voice carried across the cold morning air. She absorbed the information without visible reaction, as if she'd already known, or at least suspected. Tom stopped several feet away from the porch, giving her space. "You know who they were?" She hesitated, fingers tightening on the blanket's edge. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough, scraped raw by exposure and screaming that Tom imagined had preceded her silence. "I know what they wanted. Not who, but what." The distinction felt important, though Tom wasn't sure why yet. He waited in understanding that pushing for answers would only make her retreat further into whatever defensive walls she'd built to survive. "They wanted me to do things I wouldn't do, so they punished me. Left me here thinking." She stopped, jaw-clenching, words failing in the face of memories too fresh to articulate. Tom understood without needing her to finish. They'd left her as bait, as a trap, as a test of whatever man found her first. Expected him to be like them, to see opportunity where he saw only cruelty. "They'll come back." Not a question, just acknowledgement of probability. She nodded once, sharp and certain. "They don't give up. When they want something, they take it, or they destroy it trying." The flatness in her tone spoke to experience, to patterns learned through repetition. Tom felt anger building in his chest, again the kind that came from recognizing evil, not as an abstract concept, but as specific actions taken by specific men who needed to be stopped. How long before they realized leaving you here didn't work the way they planned? She considered this, eyes moving to the northern ridge where the tracks originated. Maybe they already know. Maybe they're watching now, deciding what to do about you. The possibility didn't surprise Tom. He'd been operating under that assumption since finding her. If they'd gone to this much trouble to leave her on his fence, they weren't going to simply abandon the investment without seeing it through. "Then they'll find me ready." Simple words, but carrying weight. She studied his face, trying to understand what kind of man he was, whether his promises of protection were real or just another variety of lie. Tom let her look, having nothing to hide beyond scars and failures that were already visible in the lines around his eyes. Why Pato, one word encompassing 1,000 questions. Why help her? Why risk bringing trouble onto his land? Why involve himself in something that wasn't his fight? Tom thought about Sarah, about the helplessness of watching her die and being unable to stop the men responsible. About 5 years of exile that hadn't erased the guilt or the rage, had just given him time to learn to live with both. He couldn't save Sarah, but he could save this woman here now. And maybe that wasn't redemption, but it was something. "Because you were chained to my fence. Because walking away isn't an option I can live with anymore." The truth, or as much of it as he could articulate. She absorbed his answer without response, neither accepting nor rejecting it, simply filing it away as data to be evaluated against future actions. "I should go inside. It's cold." Practical assessment rather than trust, but Tom would take it. She turned and walked back into the cabin, movement still unsteady, but stronger than yesterday. Tom followed after a minute, stopping first to check the rifle he kept just inside the door. The Winchester was clean loaded, ready if needed. He hoped it wouldn't be, but hope was a luxury he'd learned not to depend on. Inside, warmth from the stove drove back the morning chill. Tom moved to the small kitchen area, such as it was, a few shelves, a dry sink, supplies organized with the same precision he applied to everything. He pulled out cornmeal and dried beef ingredients for a breakfast that would be filling, if not exciting. She sat at the table watching him work. Her presence changed the space in ways Tom hadn't anticipated, made the cabin feel less like a hermitage and more like an actual dwelling place. He'd grown so accustomed to solitude that having another person in the room felt almost alien, a reminder that humans were social creatures even when they tried their hardest not to be. "What's your name?" he asked without turning around, focusing on mixing cornmeal with water in a wooden bowl. The question felt important, a line between her being a woman who'd been chained to his fence and her being a person with identity and history beyond this moment. Long silence. Tom didn't push, just continued preparing food, giving her time to decide whether sharing her name was safe or smart or worth the risk. When she finally answered, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. Anaya. The name settled into the space between them, making her real in a way she hadn't been before. Tom added wood to the stove, heating a cast-iron skillet that had cooked 1,000 lonely meals. I'm Thomas Wade. People used to call me Tom. Used to implying a time when there had been people to call him anything at all. Anaya caught the tense, filed it away along with everything else she was learning about him. Tom poured cornmeal batter onto the hot skillet, the sizzle filling silence that felt less oppressive than it had moments ago. When the food was ready, he plated it and set both portions on the table. Anaya stared at the food like she couldn't quite believe it was meant for her. No strings attached, no payment required. Tom sat across from her and started eating, demonstrating through action that this wasn't a trick. Just breakfast. She ate slowly, carefully, as if her stomach had forgotten how to process solid food. Between bites, her eyes kept drifting to the door to the windows, tracking possible entry points and escape routes. Tom understood. The cabin felt safe to him because he'd built it, because he controlled the space. To her, it was just another enclosed area where bad things could happen. You don't have to stay. He said it quietly, meaning it. If she wanted to leave, walk away, take her chances on the open land, despite her weakened condition, that was her choice to make. Tom wouldn't stop her, wouldn't argue, wouldn't try to convince her that staying was safer. Because maybe it wasn't. Maybe bringing her inside had just delayed whatever violence was coming, rather than preventing it. Anaya looked up from her plate, dark eyes meeting his across the table. Where would I go? Fair question. Tom had no answer because the same question had driven him to this land 5 years ago, and he still hadn't found a satisfactory response. Sometimes there was nowhere to go that was safe, nowhere that wasn't just another variation of the same dangers you were fleeing. Closest town is Redemption, about 40 miles south. Marshal's office, if you want to report what happened. Even as he said it, Tom heard the emptiness in his own suggestion. Report to whom Marshal Collins ran Redemption, the way most lawmen ran frontier towns, with one eye on justice and the other on whoever paid best. Tom had dealt with Collins twice in 5 years, both times coming away with the distinct impression that the badge was more ornament than office. Anaya's expression told him she'd reached the same conclusion he had, probably through harder experience. The law doesn't help people like me. Statement of fact, not self-pity. Tom couldn't argue because she was right. The law helped people who could afford lawyers, people who looked respectable, people who had connections and status, and the kind of power that came from being born into the right circumstances. A Apache woman with chain marks on her wrists and no proof beyond her word didn't fit any of those categories. Then you stay here until you're strong enough to decide what comes next. No obligations beyond that. He said it knowing the offer created complications, knowing that whoever had left her on his fence wouldn't appreciate him interfering with their plans. But Tom had stopped making decisions based on what was safe or smart around the same time Sarah died. Sometimes the only choice that mattered was the one you could live with afterward. Anaya finished eating in silence, then carried her plate to the dry sink without being asked. Small gesture, but it spoke to a desire for autonomy, for contributing, rather than just receiving. Tom understood that need, the importance of maintaining dignity through action when everything else had been stripped away. The rest of the morning passed in careful distance. Tom went outside to tend his small herd of cattle, checking water troughs and making sure the animals hadn't wandered too far during the night. Anaya stayed inside, moving around the cabin with the tentative steps of someone exploring a space they might need to defend or flee from quickly. When Tom returned for midday meal, he found she'd reorganized the supplies on the kitchen shelves, arranged them with a logic different from his, but equally practical. He didn't comment on it, recognizing the rearrangement as her way of establishing some small measure of control over her environment. They ate together again, still in silence, but it felt less strained than before. Tom was never much for conversation anyway, had spent too many years alone to remember how to fill silence with words that mattered. Anaya seemed similarly comfortable with quiet, or at least accustomed to it. It was late afternoon when Tom noticed movement on the northern ridge. Just a shadow, something that might have been a rider or might have been a trick of light against rock. He watched it without drawing attention, keeping his movements casual, while his hand drifted closer to the Winchester, leaning against the wall near the door. Anaya saw him tense, followed his gaze through the window. Her whole body went rigid, fear flooding back into her features. They're here. Tom studied the ridge more carefully. The shadow had moved, definitely not a trick of light. One rider holding position on the high ground, watching. Not approaching, not threatening, just observing. Gathering information about what Tom would do, how he'd react, whether he was the kind of threat that needed to be dealt with immediately or could be ignored. Just watching for now. They want to see what kind of man I am. He spoke quietly, trying to project calm he didn't entirely feel. Having theoretical knowledge that trouble was coming wasn't the same as seeing it materialize on your land. Tom's hand closed around the Winchester, lifting it with practiced ease. They'll see I'm the kind who doesn't back down. Bravado maybe, but sometimes bravado was all you had when the alternative was surrender. Tom moved to the door, opened. It stepped out onto the porch with the rifle clearly visible. He didn't raise it, didn't point it in any threatening direction, just held it casually, making his position clear. The rider on the ridge stayed motionless for a long moment, too far away for Tom to make out features, but close enough to read posture. Then deliberately the rider turned his horse and disappeared back over the ridge, leaving no doubt that the message had been received and would be delivered to whoever sent him. Tom stood on the porch for several minutes after the rider vanished, scanning the landscape for any other watchers, any other signs that the assessment would escalate to action today. Nothing moved. The land lay empty and cold under afternoon sun that provided light but no warmth. When he turned back inside, Anaya was standing near the table, her face drained of color, hands clenched into fists, despite the pain it must have caused her injured wrists. They know you helped me. They won't forget that. Tom leaned the Winchester back against the wall, close enough to grab quickly if needed. Good. Let them remember. Let them know that leaving people chained on my land doesn't go unanswered. The words came out harder than he intended, carrying 5 years of suppressed rage, of guilt over failures he couldn't undo, of anger at systems that protected predators and punished victims. He wasn't talking just about Anya anymore, wasn't just responding to this specific injustice. He was responding to every injustice he'd witnessed and failed to stop, every time he'd watched bad men walk free while good people suffered. Anaya studied him with new intensity, trying to reconcile his anger with his gentleness, his promises of protection with his obvious capacity for violence. You're going to get yourself killed. Probably true. Tom had made peace with that possibility 5 years ago when he left Silver Creek. Death had seemed like a relief back then, an escape from guilt and grief that had become unbearable. He'd chosen isolation instead, had picked this land specifically because its remoteness felt like a buffer against both danger and meaning. But finding Anaya chained to his fence had changed something, had reminded him that isolation didn't equal safety, that trouble found you regardless of how far you ran. And maybe, just maybe, there were things worth fighting for, even if fighting meant risking the quiet nothingness he'd built his life around. Maybe. But I'd rather die standing between you and them than live knowing I walked away. Sarah's face flashed in his memory, the last time he'd seen her alive, bruised and broken, but still trying to smile, still trying to tell him it wasn't his fault, even though they both knew different. The men who killed her had laughed when the judge dismissed charges, had celebrated their victory, like it was something to be proud of, rather than a failure of every principle the law claimed to uphold. Tom had left Silver Creek that night, had ridden until his horse collapsed from exhaustion, had kept moving until he found land empty enough to match the hollowness inside him. But apparently some debts followed you regardless of distance, demanded payment in moments you didn't choose, forced confrontations you thought you had escaped. The evening settled with the weight of an unspoken threat. Tom lit the lamp as shadows pulled in the corners of the cabin, transforming familiar spaces into something darker, more uncertain. Anya moved to the window, pulling back the cloth he used as a curtain, just enough to see the ridge where the rider had appeared hours ago. Nothing stirred in the fading light. The land stretched empty and cold, holding its secrets close. But emptiness didn't mean safety, didn't mean the watchers had given up. Tom knew from experience that the most dangerous predators were the patient ones, the ones who studied their prey before striking. He checked the Winchester again, more from ritual than necessity. The weapon was clean loaded ready, had been ready for 5 years, waiting for a reason to be more than decoration. Tom had told himself he'd left violence behind when he left Silver Creek, had convinced himself that solitude was a form of peace rather than just another kind of surrender. The lie had been easy to maintain when he was alone, when no one depended on him, when the only life at risk was his own. Anya's presence stripped away that comfortable fiction, forced him to acknowledge what he'd always known, but refused to admit that some fights couldn't be avoided. That neutrality in the face of evil was just collaboration by another name. Anya let the curtain fall, turned to face him across the small cabin. The lamplight caught her features differently now, showed traces of strength beneath the exhaustion, hints of who she'd been before chains and fear had marked her. You keep checking that rifle like you expect to use it tonight. Observation rather than question. Tom set the Winchester down, leaning it carefully against the wall where he could reach it instantly. I expect to be ready if I need to. Different thing. She moved away from the window, paced the cabin's small perimeter with restless energy that spoke to nerves wound too tight for too long. Her fingers traced along the rough wood of the table, the edge of the stove, tactile confirmation that this space was real solid here. They won't attack at night. Too many ways for things to go wrong in the dark. They'll wait for dawn, come in with the sun at their backs, so you can't see them clearly until it's too late. The specificity of her knowledge chilled Tom more than vague warnings could have. This wasn't speculation based on fear. This was tactical understanding born from experience, from watching these men operate, from surviving their patterns long enough to recognize them. How many? She stopped pacing, stood with her back to him, shoulders rigid beneath the blanket she still wore like armor. 5 that I know of, maybe more by now if they called in others. 5 armed men against one rancher who hadn't fired his rifle in anger for half a decade. The odds were bad, would have been bad even when Tom was younger, faster, less weighed down by years and guilt. But odds had never been the point. Sarah had taught him that lesson in the hardest way possible. Sometimes you fought not because you could win, but because not fighting meant becoming complicit in evil. Tell me about them. Names, faces, anything that helps me understand what's coming. Anaya turned slowly, her expression caught between reluctance and resignation. Talking about them meant revisiting trauma, meant pulling memories out of the dark places she tried to bury them. But silence wouldn't make the threat less real, wouldn't prepare Tom for what he'd face when dawn came. She moved to the table, sat down with the careful movements of someone whose body remembered pain in specific ways. Tom remained standing, giving her space to speak or not speak as she chose. Outside, full darkness had fallen, turning the world beyond the cabin into an impenetrable void punctuated only by distant stars. The leader calls himself Marcus Kane. Big man, probably 50, gray, beard, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a knife fight he lost years ago. Wears a silver watch that belonged to someone he killed, shows it off like a trophy. She paused, fingers unconsciously moving to her bandaged wrists, touching damage that Kane had likely ordered, if not inflicted personally. He runs a ranch east of here, about 60 miles toward the territories. Calls it legitimate business, cattle and horses, but everyone knows the real money comes from other things. Girls mostly taken from tribes or small settlements, sold to mining camps and railroad towns, where no one asked questions about where they came from. Tom felt his jaw tighten, muscles clenching hard enough to make his teeth ache. He'd heard rumors about operations like that, whispers that circulated among the isolated homesteaders and drifters who passed through this region. But rumors were easy to dismiss, easier than acknowledging that such deliberate evil existed and that good men did nothing to stop it. The others, Inaya's voice dropped lower, each name pulled from memory with visible effort. Ray Cutler, Kane's second. Younger, maybe 30, thinks he's smarter than he is. Carries 2 pistols, likes to spin them, shoot bottles to impress people. He's the one who put the chains on me, said I should be grateful they were giving me a chance to prove myself useful. Her tone stayed flat, emotionless, the kind of detachment that came from repeating facts too painful to feel fully. Tom listened without interrupting, cataloging information that might mean the difference between surviving and becoming another victim of men like Kane and Cutler. There's the Henshaw brothers, Jacob and Samuel. They don't talk much, just follow orders, do the dirty work. Good trackers, though, grew up hunting these mountains before they decided hunting people paid better. If Cain sends anyone to scout your land, it'll be them. Four names, four men with faces and histories and specific skills. Tom filed each detail away, building mental profiles that would help him anticipate their moves, predict their strategies. But Anya had mentioned five, and one name remained unspoken. And the fifth, she hesitated longer this time, her hands clenching into fists, despite the pain it must have caused her healing wrists. When she spoke again, her voice carried something new, not just fear, but a deeper, more personal terror. Daniel Thorne. The name dropped into the cabin's silence like a stone into dark water ripples of meaning spreading outward, even though Tom didn't yet understand their full implication. Inaya's entire posture had changed, shoulders, hunching inward, defensive, as if speaking Thorne's name could somehow summon him. He's not like the others. Cain runs the operation, but Thorne is the one you need to fear. He doesn't care about money or power or any of the things that drive normal men. He just likes hurting people, likes watching them break, and he's very good at it. Tom had known men like that during his martial days, sociopaths who wore human faces but lacked the fundamental empathy that made people people. They were the ones who escalated situations for pleasure rather than profit, who turned simple crimes into atrocities because cruelty was its own reward. Thorne was the one who suggested chaining me to your fence, said it would be interesting to see what happened, to watch how you reacted, whether you'd be like them or different. He wanted to make a game of it. The casual evil of that revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. They hadn't just used Anya as bait or abandoned her out of cruelty. They deliberately orchestrated her suffering as entertainment, as a social experiment designed to satisfy Thorne's twisted curiosity about human nature. He's watching now. Even if the others left, Thorne is still out there, somewhere close enough to see what you do, how you treat me, whether you live up to whatever expectations he has about men who find chained women on their property. Tom moved to the window, looked out at darkness that could hide anything, anyone. The thought of being observed, of having his actions measured against some psychopath's private criteria, made his skin crawl. But it also clarified something important. This wasn't just about protecting Ania from men who wanted to reclaim their property. This was about defying the worldview of someone who believed all people were fundamentally alike, that everyone would succumb to their worst impulses given the right circumstances. Then he'll be disappointed, because I'm not what he expects, and neither is what happens next. Ania stood, moved to stand beside him at the window, close, but not touching, two people united by circumstance, but still strangers in most ways that mattered. You can't fight them all. Even if you're the best shot in the territory, even if you're willing to die defending me, 5 armed men will overwhelm you. That's math, not courage. She was right, of course. Tom knew the limitations of his situation, understood that heroic intentions didn't stop bullets or overcome numerical superiority. But he'd learned something in the 5 years since Sarah died. Something about the value of bearing witness, even when you couldn't change the outcome. Maybe, but they'll remember that someone stood against them, that someone chose differently than Thorne expected. And maybe that matters more than winning. Anya turned to look at him, really look, trying to understand what drove a man to accept probable death for abstract principles. Tom met her gaze steadily, having nothing to hide, no illusions about his chances or his motives. Why does it matter to you I'm nobody? Nothing, just another Apache woman these men decided to ruin. There are hundreds like me, thousands probably scattered across the territories. You can't save us all. The question cut deeper than she probably intended, exposed the fundamental contradiction Tom had been living with since leaving Silver Creek. She was right, he couldn't save everyone, couldn't undo all the injustice in the world, couldn't resurrect Sarah or change the past, or make the system care about people who didn't fit its narrow definitions of worthy. But he could save Ania. Well, here, now, on his land where his choices mattered because no one else was around to make them. And maybe that limited, specific salvation was all anyone could ever really offer. Not grand gestures or systematic change, but individual acts of decency in the face of individual evil. I had someone once, her name was Sarah. Tom spoke quietly, words coming slowly, dragged up from places he usually kept sealed tight. Anya stayed silent, sensing that interruption would stop the story before it started. She was a school teacher in Silver Creek, taught reading and numbers to any child whose parents would let them come. Prettiest woman I'd ever seen, not because of how she looked, but because of how she looked at the world, like it was full of possibility, like people were fundamentally good and just needed chances to prove it. The memory hurt, scraped raw against 5 years of scar tissue. Tom kept his eyes on the dark window, finding it easier to speak to shadows than to Aenea's face. We were going to get married. I'd been marshal there for 3 years, saved enough money to buy a small house on the edge of town. Sarah had already picked out curtains, was planning a garden, talked about the children we'd have, and how she'd teach them to read before they could walk. He paused, breathing through the tightness in his chest that always came when he let himself remember Sarah alive, happy, full of dreams that would never materialize. One of the big ranchers in the area, a man named Callahan, had a son who fancied Sarah. Kept showing up at the schoolhouse, bringing flowers, making comments that weren't quite threats, but weren't compliments either. Sarah turned him down, polite but firm, said she was spoken for. Anaya shifted beside him, close enough now that Tom could feel the warmth of her presence, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this cabin, wasn't alone in his memories. Callahan's son didn't take rejection well. Got drunk one night, rode into town with 3 of his friends, broke into Sarah's boarding room. By the time I got there, responding to screams that woke half the town, it was too late. They'd beaten her so badly I barely recognized her face. She lived for 2 days conscious most of that time, hurting in ways I couldn't fix. The words came out flat, stripped of emotion through repetition in his own mind over countless sleepless nights. Tom had told this story to himself so many times that it had become almost abstract, a narrative about people who used to exist rather than a wound that never fully healed. I arrested them, had witnesses, had evidence, had Sarah's testimony before she died. Should have been the easiest conviction in territorial history. But Callahan was rich, connected friends with the judge and half the county government. The trial lasted 3 days. Jury deliberated for an hour before declaring all 4 boys innocent. Self-defense, they claimed. Said Sarah had invited them in, things got rough. Wasn't their fault, she was fragile. Aenea's hand found his arm, a brief touch that conveyed understanding beyond words. She knew how this story ended because she had lived versions of it herself, had seen how systems protected powerful men while discarding women who didn't fit convenient narratives. I wanted to kill them, thought about it constantly for weeks after the verdict. Could have done it too. I knew where they lived, their routines, their vulnerabilities. Would have been easy to make it look like accidents, robberies gone wrong, simple frontier violence that no one would investigate too closely. Tom finally turned from the window, met Aenea's eyes directly. But I didn't. Not because I was noble or believed in the system anymore, but because Sarah had taught me better. She'd spent her life believing people could choose differently, that violence begat violence, that breaking the cycle required someone willing to step away from it. So I left instead. Rode west, found this land, built this cabin, convinced myself that solitude was the same as peace. He gestured around the small space encompassing 5 years of isolation, of avoidance, masquerading as healing. Then you showed up chained to my fence, and I realized Sarah was right about some things, but wrong about others. Walking away doesn't break cycles. It just lets them continue without you. Sometimes the only way to honor someone who believed in the possibility of human decency is to fight like hell to prove that possibility exists. Aenea's fingers tightened on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so recently freed from chains. I'm not Sarah. Saving me won't bring her back. Truth delivered gently but firmly. Tom nodded, appreciating her directness, the way she refused to be a symbol or a proxy for his unfinished grief. I know. This isn't about redemption or closure or fixing the past. This is about right now, about you being a person who deserves not to be chained to fences, and me being a person who can't unknow that truth once I've seen it. They stood together in the lamplight, 2 damaged people bound by circumstances neither had chosen, preparing for violence that seemed inevitable, but not yet imminent. Outside, the darkness pressed against the cabin walls, patient and hungry. Inside, something shifted, an understanding forming between them that had nothing to do with romance or obligation, and everything to do with recognizing common humanity in the face of those who denied it. Tom moved away from the window, checking the cabin's defenses with renewed focus. The door had a heavy bar that could be dropped into iron brackets, turning it into something that would require significant force to breach. The windows were small, positioned high enough that climbing through would be difficult under the best circumstances, nearly impossible under fire. Ammunition for the Winchester was stored in a locked box beneath his bed, 3 dozen rounds that represented a substantial investment, but seemed inadequate now. Tom pulled the box out, opened it, began loading extra rounds into his coat pockets and distributing others to strategic locations around the cabin where he could grab them quickly. Anya watched his preparations with the attention of someone cataloging information that might prove crucial later. "You're planning for a siege." Tom nodded, sliding the ammunition box back under his bed. "If they come at dawn like you think, they'll probably try to surround the cabin, pin us inside, force a surrender. They'll expect me to give you up to save myself. When I don't, they'll escalate. Fire, maybe, or just concentrated gunfire until the walls come down." He spoke matter-of-factly, analyzing the tactical situation with the detachment of someone who'd spent years evaluating threats and planning responses. The martial training never completely left, even after 5 years of disuse. "The cabin's log construction will stop most pistol rounds, maybe even rifle fire if they're not using heavy calibers. Water's in barrels enough for several days if we ration. Food's limited but adequate. Biggest vulnerability is the roof. Dry wood and pitch would burn fast if they get torches close enough." Anya absorbed this information, her expression shifting from resignation to something more calculating, more active. She wasn't just a victim waiting to be saved. She was a participant in her own survival, someone with knowledge and skills that Tom would need if they were going to make it through what was coming. "The north wall is weakest. Logs are older. There have more gaps where chinking's worn away. If they're smart, they'll concentrate fire. They'll try to create an opening." Tom looked at the north wall, saw what she was describing, subtle imperfections he'd never bothered repairing because they didn't affect the cabin's basic habitability. But in a firefight, those gaps could mean the difference between cover and catastrophe. "Can you shoot?" The question came out before Tom fully considered it. Anya's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise or might have been dark humor. "I can shoot. Whether I can hit what I'm aiming at under pressure is a different question. Honest assessment more valuable than false confidence." Tom moved to the corner where he kept his spare weapons, an old Colt revolver he'd carried as a deputy before becoming marshal, scratched and worn but still functional. He checked the cylinder, confirming it was loaded, then held it out to her, handle first. 6 shots. If they breach the cabin, aim for center mass, squeeze the trigger, slowly, don't jerk it. You probably won't kill anyone at range, but you might make them think twice about rushing through the door. Anya took the revolver with both hands, testing its weight, her fingers wrapping around the grip with familiarity that suggested this wasn't her first time holding a weapon. Tom noted the competence in her handling, filed it away as another piece of information about who she was beyond the woman he'd found chained to his fence. "My father taught me to shoot rabbits when I was 12. Small targets, quick, required patience and steady hands. Men are bigger, slower, easier to hit if you can control the fear." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about shooting people would have been disturbing in other contexts, but Tom understood. Fear was the enemy of accuracy, and pretending otherwise just got people killed. Better to acknowledge the psychological reality of violence and plan accordingly. They spent the next hour preparing as best they could, Tom reinforcing the door with an extra beam, Anya stuffing rags into the gaps she'd identified in the north wall, both of them moving with the focused intensity of people who knew dawn might bring death. The work created a strange intimacy, not romantic but born from shared purpose, from the understanding that they were now allies in a fight neither had chosen but both had committed to. When the preparations were complete, Tom extinguished the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, broken only by dim coals in the stove. Anya settled onto the cot without being told, conserving energy for whatever came next. Tom positioned himself on the floor near the door, Winchester within easy reach, spare ammunition in his pockets and scattered within arm's reach. The darkness felt complete, absolute, a physical presence that pressed against consciousness. Tom's eyes gradually adjusted, picking out vague shapes, the outline of the stove, the rectangle of the window, Anya's form on the cot. His ears compensated for lost vision, tracking every sound, wind against walls, The settling of logs as temperature dropped, small animal noises from outside that might or might not be something more dangerous. Time passed slowly, measured in breaths and heartbeats rather than minutes or hours. Tom's thoughts drifted, despite his intention to stay alert, pulled back to Sarah to Silver Creek, to the trial that had demonstrated how easily justice could be perverted when money and power conspired against truth. He'd stood in that courtroom listening to lawyers tear apart Sarah's character, suggesting she'd brought violence on herself through immodest behavior, or poor choices, or any of a dozen other victim-blaming narratives that made her death easier to dismiss. Had watched the judge nod along with arguments that wouldn't have convinced a child, had seen the jury brought all men, all property owners, all part of the same system that protected their own, deliver a verdict that everyone knew was wrong, but no one would challenge. The rage Tom felt then had been hot, immediate, consuming. He'd wanted to shoot his way through the courthouse, kill Callahan's son and his friends right there in front of everyone, make them understand through violence what words and testimony and evidence couldn't convey, that Sarah had mattered, that her life had value, that her death demanded consequences. But he'd walked away instead, had chosen exile over murder, had told himself he was honoring Sarah's beliefs about nonviolence and breaking cycles. 5 years of isolation had cooled the rage without extinguishing. It had given him time to realize that walking away hadn't been noble restraint. It had been cowardice, dressed up as principle. Finding Ania chained to his fence brought everything back, stripped away the comfortable lies Tom had built around his retreat from the world. He couldn't save Sarah, couldn't undo the injustice that had killed her and let her killers walk free. But he could save Ania. Could stand between her and men who thought women were property to be used and discarded. Could demonstrate through action, rather than words, that some people still chose differently, still believed that decency was worth defending, even when the cost was high. If Tom died tomorrow, if Kane and his men overwhelmed the cabins of defenses and killed both him and Ania, at least he would die having tried, having refused to be the kind of man Thorne expected when he orchestrated this sick experiment. That wouldn't redeem his failure to save Sarah, wouldn't earn forgiveness or absolve guilt. But it would mean something, would prove that the capacity for choosing differently still existed, even in a world that seemed designed to reward cruelty. Ania's breathing had evened out, fallen into the deep rhythm of genuine sleep. Tom envied her ability to rest, wondered what it took to find peace after what she'd endured. Maybe exhaustion was his own form of mercy, shutting down consciousness when waking awareness became too painful to maintain. The night stretched on, endless and patient. Tom dozed, occasionally shallow naps that maintained some awareness of surroundings without fully surrendering consciousness. Each time he woke, he checked the windows, the door, the shadows that might or might not contain threats. Nothing moved. The darkness held its secrets, refused to reveal what dawn would bring. Somewhere past midnight, Tom heard something that made him fully alert: hoofbeats, distant but distinct, multiple horses moving at a steady pace. Not approaching the cabin directly, but circling, staying at the edges of his property, maintaining distance while establishing presence. The watchers had returned, reinforced their numbers, prepared for whatever action they decided was necessary. Tom counted riders by sound, years of experience, letting him distinguish individual horses by the rhythm of their gaits, the weight of their steps. 5, maybe 6, moving in a loose perimeter around his land. Exactly as Ania had predicted, Kane wasn't taking chances, was committing his full crew to whatever he had planned. The hoofbeats continued for perhaps 20 minutes, completing their circuit before fading back into the larger silence. Message delivered, presence established, threat made clear. They were out there waiting, and when dawn came, they would act. Tom checked his weapons again, more from ritual than necessity. The Winchester was loaded, ready. The Colt Ania had was his backup insurance against the rifle jamming or running empty at a crucial moment. Additional ammunition was distributed where he could reach it quickly. Water and food were within easy access. The cabin's defenses were as strong as they could be, given time and resources. Preparation was important, but Tom knew from experience that plans rarely survive first contact with reality. Something would go wrong, something unexpected would happen, some variable he hadn't accounted for would shift the situation in ways that required improvisation. The key was staying flexible, adapting to circumstances, rather than clinging rigidly to predetermined strategies. The darkness began thinning toward the eastern horizon, subtle gradations of gray replacing absolute black. Dawn approached with the inevitability of a tide bringing light and danger in equal measure. Tom rose from his position by the door, stretched muscles stiff from hours of tense waiting, prepared himself mentally for whatever the day would bring. Ania woke without prompting, her eyes opening, as if some internal alarm had signaled that rest time was over. She sat up, looked toward the window where pale light was beginning to seep through cracks in the shutters. They're here. Not a question, just acknowledgement of shared knowledge. Tom moved to the window, carefully pulled back the shutter's edge just enough to see out. Dawn light painted the land in shades of gray and gold, revealing what darkness had hidden. 5 riders sat their horses in a loose semicircle about 200 yards from the cabin, positioned just beyond effective rifle range. They made no effort to hide, wanted to be seen. Wanted Tom to understand exactly what he was facing. Behind them, the sun climbed slowly over the eastern ridge, turning their silhouettes into dark shapes haloed with light that made identifying features impossible. Tom studied the riders, cataloging what he could see: sizes, postures, the way they carried themselves. One man sat slightly forward of the others, his bearing suggesting command authority. Cain, probably the leader Ania had described. The others flanked him in positions that suggested coordination planning, men who'd worked together before and knew each other's capabilities. As Tom watched, the central figure raised one hand, a gesture that seemed almost casual but carried clear meaning. The riders spread out, widening their arc, positioning themselves to cover multiple approaches to the cabin. Not an immediate attack, but preparation for one tactical positioning that eliminated Tom's ability to escape or maneuver. Anaya joined him at the window, standing close enough that Tom could feel tension radiating from her body like heat. That's Cain in the center. The one to his right, smaller with 2 pistols visible, that's Cutler. The others will be the Henshaw brothers and Thorne, though I can't tell which is which from here. Tom filed the information away, connecting names to positions, building a tactical picture. Cain would be the decision maker, the one whose elimination would disrupt their coordination. But Thorne was the wild card, the one whose motivations weren't about profit or control, but something darker, less predictable. The central figure, Cain nudged his horse forward, several steps close enough now that his voice would carry across the distance. Thomas Wade. The name rolled across the cold morning air, amplified by the silence that surrounded it. Tom had expected this, the formal opening of negotiations that would inevitably fail because their positions were irreconcilable. Cain wanted Ania back. Tom wouldn't give her up. Everything else was just theater delay tactics before violence became the only language both sides shared. I see you found our property. Decent of you to keep her alive while we sorted out some business. We'll be taking her back now. Property. The word crystallized everything Tom needed to know about how Cain viewed the world, how he justified actions that most people would recognize as monstrous. Ania wasn't a person in his framework, wasn't someone with rights or autonomy or value beyond her utility to his operation. She was an asset, stolen property that needed to be recovered and disciplined for the inconvenience her escape had caused. Tom considered his response, weighing options. He could try reasoning, could explain that Ania wasn't property, that she had the right to refuse, that what Cain was doing was wrong by any reasonable moral standard. But reason only worked when both parties operated from shared principles, and nothing about Cain's casual reference to human beings as property suggested he was open to ethical arguments. He could try negotiating, could offer something Cain wanted in exchange for leaving Ania alone. But Tom had nothing Cain couldn't simply take by force: no money, no political connections, no leverage beyond his willingness to make recovering Ania expensive in terms of blood and bullets. And somehow Tom suspected that calculus wouldn't deter men who'd built their operation on violence and intimidation, which left only one real option. The one Tom had known from the moment he'd found Ania chained to his fence was inevitable. He would refuse, they would attack, and the morning would end with some people dead and others alive. The outcome determined by skill, luck, and the countless small variables that decided every violent confrontation. Tom moved to the door, lifted the bar, pulled it open, just wide enough that he could be seen clearly, but still maintain cover. The cold morning air rushed in, carrying scents of horse and leather, and something else, the metallic tang of anticipated violence that anyone who'd been in combat recognized instinctively. Cain shifted in his saddle, studying Tom with the assessing gaze of someone evaluating a potential obstacle. The distance was too great for Tom to make out detailed features, But body language conveyed confidence, the certainty of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through combination of wealth, violence, and the knowledge that the system wouldn't punish him for either. Tom's response carried across the morning stillness, each word chosen for clarity and finality. She's not your property. She stays here, you leave my land. That's how this ends without anyone dying. Silence followed, stretching out long enough that it became its own form of answer. Then Kane laughed, the sound harsh and genuinely amused, as if Tom had told a joke rather than issued an ultimatum. You really think one man with a rifle changes anything? We'll burn you out, Wade. Torch that cabin with both of you inside, if that's what it takes. Or you can be smart and hand her over, walk away breathing. Your choice. Threats and offers, exactly as Tom had predicted. Kane was giving him the opportunity to surrender without losing face to frame compliance, as pragmatic wisdom rather than cowardice. Standard negotiating tactic when you held superior force, make the opponent's defeat seem like their decision, allow them to preserve some dignity in exchange for capitulation. Tom felt Aenea's presence behind him, knew she was listening to every word, waiting to see what kind of man he actually was now that the moment of truth had arrived. Easy enough to make brave promises in the safety of the cabin, in the abstract space of planning. Harder to maintain those promises when 5 armed men offered you the chance to survive by betraying someone who depended on you. But Tom had made this choice years ago in a Silver Creek courtroom where he'd watched justice fail and chosen exile over murder. Had reinforced it through 5 years of isolation that was supposed to be healing, but was really just avoidance. Had finalized it the moment he unlocked chains from Aenea's wrists and brought her inside his cabin, because that action had been a declaration, a line drawn in the dirt that said, this far and no farther. My choice was made when I found her chained to my fence. You want her, you come through me. I'm old enough to know how that ends, but I'll take at least one of you with me. Maybe more if I'm lucky. You willing to pay that price for a woman who isn't worth dying over? The response was calculated, aimed not at Kane, but at the men flanking him. Leaders could afford to be cavalier about casualties, but the men who'd actually take the bullets had more immediate concerns about survival. If Tom could fracture their unity, make them question whether recovering one woman justified the risk, maybe he could create hesitation, doubt the kind of crack in resolve that sometimes prevented violence from escalating to its inevitable conclusion. But Kane had anticipated this tactic, responded with the easy confidence of someone who'd led men into danger before and knew how to maintain their loyalty. Boys aren't worried. We've dealt with worse than one aging rancher with delusions of nobility. Besides, Ray here has been wanting to test those fancy pistols against someone who shoots back. Isn't that right, Ray? One of the riders, Cutler, presumably shifted forward, his enthusiasm visible even at this distance. Young men desperate to prove themselves were always the most dangerous, too stupid to understand their own mortality, too eager for glory to calculate actual risks. Tom recognized the dynamic, had seen it play out in countless confrontations during his martial days. Kane was using Cutler's aggression to shore up group cohesion, demonstrating leadership through his ability to channel and direct violence rather than suppress it. Smart tactic, one that made negotiation pointless, because Kane had already committed his crew to action, had made backing down more costly to their collective identity than whatever price Tom might extract through resistance, which meant the talking was over, had probably been over before it started. Everything from here forward was just mechanics, positioning, timings, the brutal algebra of weapons and will measured against cover and competence. Tom stepped back inside the cabin, closed the door, dropped the bar into place. The heavy beams settled into iron brackets with a solid thunk that sounded like finality, like a gate closing on possibilities that no longer existed. He turned to find Aenea holding the Colt revolver, not pointing it at anything but ready. Her expression set in lines that suggested she'd moved past fear into the cold clarity that sometimes came when you accepted death as a likely outcome and decided to make it expensive for everyone involved. How long? Her question was practical, focused on tactics rather than emotions. Tom respected that, appreciated her ability to compartmentalize, to separate the trauma of what these men had done to her from the immediate necessity of surviving their next interaction. Minutes, probably. Kane will give a speech, work his boys up, make sure they understand this is necessary and justified and righteous. Then they'll spread out, try to surround the cabin, cut off any chance of escape. When they're positioned, they'll call for surrender one more time because that's what you do, and when we refuse, they'll start shooting. Tom moved to the north wall, the one Anya had identified as weakest, positioned himself where he could see through gaps in the chinking while maintaining cover behind solid logs. The Winchester felt good in his hands, familiar. Despite years of disuse, the weight and balance triggering muscle memory carved deep through thousands of hours of practice. The goal isn't to kill them all. That's impossible. The goal is to make them pay enough that continuing seems stupider than retreating. Wound 2, maybe 3, force them to reconsider whether you're worth dying over. If we're lucky, they cut their losses right away, come back with a different plan that gives us time to figure out next steps. Ania moved to the window on the opposite wall, positioning herself where she could cover a different angle, provide crossfire if anyone tried to breach from that direction. Her movements were economical, efficient, suggesting competence beyond what she'd admitted. Tom filed that away, adding it to his growing understanding of who she was, not just a victim to be saved, but a survivor with skills and strength that circumstances had temporarily overwhelmed. Outside, the riders were moving, spreading out exactly as Tom had predicted. They maintained distance, stayed beyond accurate rifle range, professional in their approach. These weren't amateur thugs hoping to intimidate through posturing. They were experienced, had done this before, knew how to execute violence efficiently while minimizing their own exposure to risk. Tom tracked Kane's position, watched as the leader directed his men through gestures rather than shouts, maintaining operational security, even though his target could see exactly what they were doing. The tactical competence suggested military background, maybe cavalry experience during the war, knowledge forged through combat against enemies more dangerous than one isolated rancher. The thought was simultaneously concerning and clarifying. If Kane was veteran cavalry, he'd have training in siege tactics in coordinating assaults in the patient application of force against defended positions. But he'd also have learned against opponents who had comparable resources, who could call for reinforcements, who existed within military command structures that provided support and backup. Tom had none of those advantages, was truly alone except for Ania, had no hope of rescue or relief. But he also had nothing to lose except his life, and he'd made peace with that possibility years ago. Sometimes the only victory available was making your death mean something, leaving behind evidence that you'd chosen differently than evil men expected. The riders completed their positioning, creating a loose perimeter around the cabin with overlapping fields of fire that eliminated blind spots. Tom counted muzzles, calculated angles, recognized the formation as textbook encirclement, the kind of thing you learned in military academies or through hard experience under officers who'd studied warfare seriously. Kane's voice carried across the distance, one final time, formal and impersonal, delivering the ritual last warning that both sides knew was meaningless. Last chance, Wade. Throw out the girl, walk away clean. Make us come in there, and you die along with her. Your choice. Tom didn't bother responding, having said everything necessary earlier. Silence was its own answer, defiance expressed through the absence of further negotiation. Let Kane interpret that however he wanted, as stubbornness, nobility, stupidity. The interpretation didn't matter. Only the outcome mattered, the undeniable fact that some people still refused to surrender to evil, even when surrender was the logical, safe, smart choice. The first shot shattered the morning stillness, a rifle crack that echoed off distant ridges before dying into silence. Tom heard the bullet impact wood, probably the door testing its strength, confirming that the cabin's log construction would indeed stop rounds. Probing shot, reconnaissance by fire, exactly what he would have done in Kane's position. More shots followed in a ragged volley, multiple weapons firing from different positions, converging on the cabin from multiple angles. Tom stayed behind cover, not returning fire yet, conserving ammunition, letting them waste rounds on blind shooting, while he gathered information about their positions and capabilities. The fusillade continued for perhaps 30 seconds before tapering off into sporadic individual shots. Tom used the pause to risk a quick look through the gap in the north wall, cataloging positions, confirming what the sound patterns had already told him. They were spread out, disciplined, maintaining distance while pouring enough fire to keep defenders pinned down. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, sighted carefully on the nearest visible rider, exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger with the smooth, controlled pressure that good marksmanship required. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, the report sharp and authoritative in the confined space of the cabin. Tom didn't see if his shot connected, had already dropped back behind cover before return fire could find him. But he heard a cry of pain or surprise, confirmation that his bullet had at least come close, had reminded the attackers that the cabin had teeth, that taking it would cost blood and possibly lives. The pattern was established now, would repeat with variations until one side exhausted resources or lost the will to continue. They would fire attempting to suppress and intimidate. Tom and Ania would return fire when opportunities presented, making each exposure expensive, forcing the attackers to respect the defenders' capability to inflict casualties. Time became elastic, stretching and compressing unpredictably. Minutes felt like hours, hours like seconds. The objective passage of time irrelevant compared to the subjective experience of waiting for the next volley, the next decision point, the next moment when you had to expose yourself to enemy fire because not shooting meant surrendering initiative. Tom moved between positions, never staying in one place long enough to become predictable, using different gaps and firing angles to create the impression of multiple defenders. He learned this during the war, how to make one rifleman seem like three or four, through constant movement and varied timing, psychological warfare aimed at degrading enemy confidence. Ania fired occasionally from her window, her shots less accurate than Tom's, but still forcing the attackers to account for multiple threats. Tom noted with approval that she didn't waste ammunition, didn't spray bullets wildly, showed the discipline that separated people who survived combat from those who died quickly. The siege continued through the morning, both sides settling into a rhythm of advance and retreat, attack and counterattack, the deadly dance of men trying to kill each other from behind cover. Tom's world narrowed to immediate concerns: ammunition count, water consumption, the structural integrity of walls under sustained fire, the physical and psychological state of his only ally. Somewhere around midday, the pattern shifted. The firing stopped, completely silence falling over the landscape like a blanket, oppressive in its totality after hours of constant gunfire. Tom's ears rang, making it hard to hear subtler sounds, but instinct warned that the absence of shooting didn't mean the threat had passed. He risked a careful look through multiple gaps, scanning the area where riders had been positioned. Empty. The horses and men had vanished and pulled back beyond visual range, either retreating or regrouping for a different approach. Ania moved to join him near the north wall, her face streaked with powder smoke, her hands steady despite hours of tension. They're not done. This is the pause before they try something different. Tom agreed, but couldn't see what that something different might be. They learned that the cabin couldn't be taken by simple frontal assault, that the defenders had enough ammunition and skill to make such attempts prohibitively expensive, which meant Kane would shift tactics, would employ the training and experience that had kept him alive through whatever battles had forged him into the man he was now. The answer came minutes later in the form of smoke, thin wisps, at first barely visible against the pale sky. Then thicker plumes, dark and oily, rising from multiple directions around the cabin's perimeter. They'd set the grass on fire, were using wind and dry vegetation to drive flames toward the structure, forcing Tom and Ania to choose between burning inside or fleeing into open ground where rifles would cut them down. Tom's heart sank as he recognized the inevitability of their situation. He'd anticipated this possibility, had known that fire was the ultimate solution to sieges against wooden structures. But anticipating something and experiencing it were different, separated by the gap between theory and reality, between knowing you might die and feeling death approaching through heat and smoke. He turned to Ania, saw his own recognition reflected in her eyes. They both understood what this moment represented, the crossing of a threshold beyond which only hard choices remained. Stay and burn, or run and be shot. No third option, no clever tactical solution that somehow threaded the needle between impossible alternatives. But Tom hadn't survived this long by accepting the choices others presented as the only options available. Sometimes you created your own alternatives, found cracks in apparently seamless plans, exploited the arrogance of men who assumed their victims would conform to expected patterns. Get ready to move. When I say run, you run north toward the ridge. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just run as hard as you can. I'll be right behind you, providing cover fire. If I go down, keep running. You understand? Anaya nodded, her jaw set in determination. that suggested she'd already calculated the odds and decided that dying while trying was better than dying while waiting. Tom respected that, recognized the fierce refusal to surrender that had probably kept her alive through everything Kane and his men had done before chaining her to the fence. He moved to the door, checked one final time that the Winchester had a full magazine, that spare ammunition was distributed where he could grab it during movement. The Colt revolver Ania carried would provide additional firepower, though its shorter range meant she'd be most effective at close quarters, exactly the situation Tom hoped to avoid. The smoke thickened, creeping under the door, and through the gaps and chinking that had seemed so minor earlier, but now provided pathways for the fire's advance. Tom's eyes watered, throat burning from the acrid fumes, body's automatic response to danger that couldn't be fought with bullets. He gripped the door, bar muscles tensing in preparation for what came next. This was it, the moment when all preparation and plannings gave way to action, when you stopped thinking and started moving because hesitation meant death. Tom lifted the bar, threw the door open, and charged into smoke and fire and the waiting rifles of men who wanted him dead. The world exploded into chaos the moment Tom cleared the doorway. Smoke choked his lungs, thick and oily from burning grass mixed with something else, kerosene, probably accelerant, to make sure the fire spread fast and hot. Through the gray haze, muzzle flashes sparked like fireflies, bullets whipping past close enough that Tom felt their displacement of air against his skin. He fired the Winchester from his hip, not aiming but suppressing, forcing the shooters to duck or die, creating just enough hesitation to give Ania the second she needed. She burst through the door behind him, low and fast, the Colt clutched in both hands, her feet already moving toward the northern ridge before her mind had fully processed the decision to run. Tom pivoted, bringing the rifle to his shoulder, sighting through smoke on a shape that resolved into Ray Cutler, the young gunman, with his fancy pistols already clearing leather. Tom's shot caught him high in the chest, spinning him backward off his horse in a spray of blood that looked black against the smoke-filtered sunlight. One down, return fire converged on Tom's position, multiple rifles speaking in ragged concert. He felt a bullet tug at his coat sleeve, another kick up dirt near his boot, a third splinter wood from the door frame he'd just abandoned. Too much fire, too concentrated, the kind of volume that said his initial assessment had been wrong. There weren't 5 men, there were more reinforcements Kane had held in reserve for exactly this moment. Tom ran not in Ania's direction, but perpendicular to it, drawing fire away from her path, making himself the primary target through movement and aggression. He worked the Winchester's lever without conscious thought, muscle memory from 1,000 drills, guiding his hands, fired again at a rider trying to flank around the cabin's eastern edge. Miss, but close enough to make the man veer off course by another few seconds. The ridgeline Ania was climbing seemed impossibly far, an endless expanse of open ground where every step made her more visible, more vulnerable. Tom's entire world narrowed to keeping the riders focused on him, to being interesting enough, threatening enough that they couldn't spare attention for the woman struggling up rocky slope that promised cover if she could just reach it. A bullet found him inevitable, given the volume of fire. Pain exploded through his left thigh, hot and sharp, the impact driving him to one knee before training. Overrode shock forced him upright again, through pure, stubborn refusal to fall while Ania still needed him. He fired back at the shooter, saw the man clutch his shoulder and fall, couldn't tell if it was a killing shot or just a wound, but it didn't matter because the man was out of the fight either way. Tom's leg threatened to buckle with each step, blood soaking through his pants, warm and slick. He'd been shot before during the war, knew the difference between hits that killed quickly and hits you could survive if you stayed conscious and kept moving. This was survivable, probably missed the femoral artery given how he wasn't spraying blood, but it hurt like hell and his mobility was already compromised. Ania reached the ridgeline, disappeared over it into dead ground where the riders couldn't easily follow. Relief flooded through Tom, brief and intense. Knowing she'd made it, she was clear whatever happened next, at least one person would survive this disaster. Then Daniel Thorne stepped out from behind the burning cabin, and Tom understood he'd made a terrible miscalculation. Thorne hadn't been with the other riders, hadn't participated in the siege or the firefight, had waited instead with the patience of a spider in its web, letting the chaos unfold until exactly this moment. He stood 15 feet away, close enough that missing would require deliberate effort, his revolver already drawn and aimed at Tom's center mass. But Thorne wasn't shooting, wasn't finishing. The obvious kill was instead studying Tom with an expression of intense curiosity, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. He was younger than Tom expected, maybe 35, with sharp features and eyes that reflected light wrong, gave the impression of something fundamentally broken behind the facade of humanity. "You surprise me." Thorne's voice carried easily across the distance, conversational, despite the gunfire still echoing from other directions despite the smoke and blood and violence that surrounded them. He smiled, and it was the smile of someone who didn't quite understand what smiling was supposed to communicate, had learned the expression mechanically without grasping its emotional context. Most men would have given her up. Self-preservation is supposed to be the strongest instinct, right? But you threw yourself into fire for someone you just met. That's interesting. That's worth studying. Tom raised the Winchester, knowing he was too slow, that Thorne already had the drop on him, that this was how it ended, not in heroic last stands, but in stupid tactical mistakes in underestimating enemies who'd planned more carefully than you had. But Thorne didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he holstered his revolver, a gesture so unexpected that Tom almost shot him from pure confusion. "I'm not going to kill you, Thomas Wade. You're more valuable alive, seeing what other choices you make, watching how far you'll go before self-preservation finally kicks in. Kane wants the woman back. I want to see if you're actually different or just slower to break than most." The casual evil of it, the reduction of Tom's choices and Ania's suffering to some kind of psychological experiment, ignited rage that burned hotter than the pain in his leg. He started to squeeze the Winchester's trigger, intending to end whatever game Thorne thought he was playing, but movement in his peripheral vision stopped him. Marcus Kane rode into view, his horse picking through smoke and scattered fire. His bearded face set in lines that suggested anger barely contained. He looked at Ray Cutler's body, at Tom, standing wounded but defiant, at Thorne's studied calm in the midst of chaos. "Enough of this. Kill him or let's go." Kane's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. But Thorne shook his head, still watching Tom with that unsettling intensity. "No, let him run. Let him think he won. When he discovers what's really at stake, when the consequences of his noble choices become clear, then we'll see what kind of man he actually is." Kane spat into the dirt, disgust evident in the gesture. "You and your games. We're down one man already because you wanted to play with our food. But fine, you're paying me enough that I'll tolerate the indulgence. Wade, you've got 24 hours to bring the woman back to the crossroads west of Redemption. Come alone unarmed, maybe we let you both walk away. Don't show or try something clever, and we'll hunt you across every mile of territory until there's nowhere left to run." The ultimatum delivered, Kane wheeled his horse and rode back towards where the other surviving members of his crew were regrouping. Thorne lingered a moment longer, his gaze moving from Tom to the ridge where Anya had disappeared, then back again. 24 hours. I'm excited to see what you choose. I have theories you understand about the nature of human morality when tested properly. You're going to help me prove or disprove them." Then he was gone too, vanishing into smoke and distance, leaving Tom standing alone amid burning grass and his own blood, trying to process what had just happened and why he was still alive when by all rights he should be dead. The adrenaline that had sustained Tom through the fight began to fade, leaving in its wake the reality of his injuries and situation. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, a deep, aching pain that promised worse complications if he didn't treat it soon. Blood had soaked through his pants, running into his boot, leaving a trail any competent tracker could follow. Tom forced himself to move, limping toward the ridge, where Ania had disappeared, each step an exercise in will over body. The cabin behind him burned properly, now flames consuming 5 years of solitude, destroying the refuge he'd built to escape the world. Fitting somehow that saving someone had cost him the very isolation he'd sought. The climb up the ridge was agony, his wounded leg refusing to support full weight muscles, trembling from exhaustion and blood loss. Tom used the Winchester as a makeshift cane, jamming the stock into rocky soil for leverage, pulling himself upward through determination and the knowledge that stopping meant dying. When he finally crested the ridge, Tom found Anya crouched behind a boulder, the Colt still gripped in her hands, her eyes tracking his approach until she recognized him through the smoke and distance. Relief flooded her features, followed immediately by concern when she saw how badly he was limping. She scrambled down to meet him, her hands immediately going to his leg, assessing the wound, with the kind of practiced competence that suggested field medicine experience. "You're shot." Statement of obvious fact, but Tom appreciated her directness, the absence of panic or useless questions. He lowered himself to the ground, letting her examine the wound now that immediate danger had passed. "Went through the outside of the thigh. Missed bone, probably missed the artery or I'd be dead already. Hurts like hell, but I'll live." Ania tore strips from her already damaged skirt, wadded them against the entry and exit wounds, applied pressure that made Tom's vision white out for a moment before clearing again. She worked quickly, efficiently, tying makeshift bandages tight enough to slow bleeding without cutting off circulation. Why didn't they follow? Why didn't Thorne kill you? Tom had been asking himself the same questions, trying to understand the psychology of men who operated by rules he didn't share or comprehend. The answer, when it came, brought no comfort. Because Thorne doesn't want me dead. He wants to watch what happens next, see how I react to whatever consequences he's engineered. We've got 24 hours to surrender at some crossroads west of Redemption, or he hunts us down. Anya finished securing the bandages, sat back on her heels, her face unreadable. "You should leave me. Take a horse ride in any direction that isn't here. Start over somewhere they'll never find you. You've done more than anyone had a right to expect. Now save yourself while you can." Tom almost laughed at the suggestion, would have if his leg didn't hurt so much that even breathing felt like work. "That's not how this works. I didn't throw away 5 years of isolation in a perfectly good cabin just to abandon you the moment things got complicated. We're in this together now, whatever that means." She studied him with an expression that mixed gratitude with something darker, more complex. "You really don't understand what you've committed to. Kane isn't the real danger. Men like him can be reasoned with, bought off, ordered if you're clever and lucky. But Thorne is different. He won't stop until his curiosity is satisfied, until he's broken down whatever it is about you that resists his expectations. And I've seen what he does to people who interest him. Death would be a mercy compared to what he has planned." Tom understood she was trying to scare him into self-preservation, trying to give him permission to abandon her without guilt. But fear had stopped being a useful motivator, somewhere between finding her chained to his fence and charging into fire to save her. Once you crossed certain lines, once you committed fully to a course of action, despite knowing the cost, fear became just another sensation to be acknowledged and ignored. Then I guess we figure out how to be uninteresting. "Come on, we need to move." Even if Thorne's playing some long game, the Henshaw brothers are trackers. They'll follow our blood trail eventually, and I'd prefer to have distance and cover before they do. Tom struggled to his feet, accepted Ania's support without protest, recognizing that masculine pride was a luxury he couldn't afford with a hole in his leg and enemies who'd return once they finished regrouping. They moved together into the broken landscape north of Tom's property, leaving behind the burning cabin and the body of Ray Cutler, and everything Tom had built to keep the world at arm's length. The ridge gave way to a series of shallow valleys separated by rocky outcrops terrain that offered concealment if you knew how to use it, but was hell to traverse on a good day, let alone when you were injured and exhausted. Tom pushed through pain with the grim determination of someone who'd learned during the war that suffering was temporary, but quitting was permanent. Anaya matched his pace despite her own exhaustion, her presence steady and competent in ways Tom was coming to rely on. She didn't complain, didn't slow them down with questions or doubt, just moved forward with the same fierce determination that had kept her alive through whatever horrors had preceded her appearance on Tom's fence. They traveled for perhaps 2 hours, putting distance between themselves and the cabin, before Tom's leg finally gave out completely. He collapsed against a boulder vision, swimming breath coming in ragged gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with blood loss and shock catching up. Anaya eased him down more carefully, checking his bandages, her face tightening when she saw how much blood had soaked through the makeshift dressings. "You need proper medical care. This needs to be clean-stitched, treated with antiseptic. Infection will kill you just as surely as a bullet if we don't address it." Tom knew she was right, but couldn't see how to act on that knowledge. The nearest doctor was in Redemption, 40 miles away, through territory Kane's men would be watching. Showing up at any official location meant explaining the situation to authorities who wouldn't care about context or justice, would see only an isolated rancher who'd killed one of Marcus Kane's employees and kidnapped a woman Kane claimed as property. Can't go to redemption. Can't go anywhere Kane has eyes. We need to find somewhere to lay low, figure out our next move without half the territory hunting us. Anaya was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant, considering options Tom couldn't see. I know a place. It's not close, maybe 15 miles northwest from here. Old mission ruins abandoned for decades. Some of my people use it as a way station, a place to rest between longer journeys. There might be supplies there, medicine, at least shelter, while we decide what comes next. Tom seized on the suggestion, having no better alternatives. 15 miles might as well have been 100 given his current condition, but people had survived worse injuries with worse prospects. You just had to reduce the problem to manageable pieces, the next mile, the next hour, the next decision that kept you breathing. Lead the way. I'll keep up or die trying. They moved again slower now that Tom's initial adrenaline had fully depleted, leaving only raw determination and Ania's support to keep him moving forward. The sun climbed higher approaching afternoon, the November cold giving way to heat that made Tom's wounds throb with intensified urgency. He lost track of time, measured progress by landmarks rather than minutes. A distinctive rock formation, a dry stream bed, a stand of cottonwood trees that marked the boundary between his land and the vast emptiness beyond. Each step became its own small victory, proof that he hadn't quit, yet hadn't surrendered to pain or despair, or the rational voice suggesting that lying down and dying would be easier than continuing. Anaya talked while they walked, filling silence with words that might have been intended to distract Tom from his suffering, or might have been her own need to process trauma through speech. I wasn't always alone. I had a family, a community, people who cared whether I lived or died. My father was a healer, taught me about plants that could cure or kill, about reading the land for signs of weather and water and danger. My mother wove baskets so beautiful that traders would travel days just to see them. She paused, adjusting her grip on Tom's arm, taking more of his weight as they navigated a particularly rocky section. Kane's men came 3 months ago. They wanted women for their operation, young ones preferably, but anyone who could work would do. Most of our people were away on a seasonal hunt, left behind only elders and children and a few adults to watch over them. We tried to resist. My father shot one of the Henshaw brothers before they killed him. My mother fought with a knife before Cutler broke her arm and dragged her away. Tom listened in understanding that this wasn't just backstory, but a gift, Ania sharing pieces of herself that explained why she'd survived when others might have given up. Rage was a powerful motivator, the desire for justice or revenge, keeping people alive long after hope had died. They separated us, sold some to mining camps, some to railroad crews, kept the ones they thought would be most profitable for longer-term operations. I was supposed to be grateful. Cutler said that they recognized my value. Instead, I ran, got almost 10 miles before the Henshaw brothers tracked me down, brought me back to Kane's ranch, where they kept me for 2 weeks as an example to the others. The flatness in her tone told Tom more than graphic details could have suggested, experiences she couldn't articulate, wouldn't articulate, horrors that existed as memories but refused translation into words. When I ran again, they didn't track me immediately. They let me think I'd escaped, let me run until exhaustion and dehydration made me careless. Then they appeared, chained me up, and brought me to your fence. Thorne said it would be educational, seeing what happened when they left me for some isolated rancher to find. He bet Kane that you'd use me exactly like they had proved his theory that all men were fundamentally the same when given opportunity and anonymity. Tom felt sick understanding the full context of his situation, realizing he'd been cast as an unwitting participant in Thorne's demented social experiment. Every choice he'd made, freeing Aniawai, bringing her inside, treating her wounds, defending her against Kane's crew, had been observed and evaluated, measured against Thorne's expectations about human nature. You proved him wrong. That's why he's so interested now, why he let you live. You weren't supposed to be decent. You were supposed to confirm his cynicism, validate his belief that morality is just a pretense people maintain until consequences disappear. Instead, you risked everything for a stranger, and now he wants to understand why, wants to push you until you break, or until you prove his entire worldview is flawed. The ruins appeared as the sun began its descent toward evening, ancient adobe walls rising from desert landscape like broken teeth, remnants of Spanish missionaries who'd brought their gout and their diseases and their complicated relationship with indigenous peoples to this remote place generations ago. Most of the structure had collapsed, reclaimed by weather and time, but portions remained intact enough to provide shelter from wind and observation. Anaya led Tom through a gap in the outer wall into what had once been a courtyard now choked with sage and prickly pear. She guided him to an inner room where the roof still held, where walls blocked the worst of the elements, where they might rest without being immediately visible to anyone passing nearby. Tom collapsed onto the dirt floor, too exhausted to care about comfort, grateful just to stop moving. Ania disappeared for several minutes, returned with items scavenged from hidden caches, a blanket, a water skin, dried meat that was probably weeks old but edible, and most importantly, a small leather pouch containing what looked like medical supplies. She worked on Tom's wound with renewed focus now that they had time and light, cleaning away dried blood, examining entry and exit holes with professional detachment. Her fingers moved with a surety, suggesting this wasn't her first time treating gunshot trauma. The bullet went clean through, which is good. No fragments to dig out. But there's definitely muscle damage, and infection is a real concern given how long it's been exposed. I'm going to pack it with herbs that will help, but you need to understand you won't be running or fighting anytime soon. Tom nodded, accepting the limitation. His body had already made that clear, was shutting down systems non-essential to immediate survival, conserving energy for healing rather than action. Anaya's hands were surprisingly gentle as she packed the wound with crushed plant matter that smelled astringent and vaguely familiar. Yarrow, probably, maybe some sage, other medicinals Tom recognized from his mother's frontier remedies. The pain was immediate and intense, but underneath it came a cooling sensation that promised relief if he could endure the initial treatment. Your father taught you this. Statement rather than question. Ania secured fresh bandages torn from cloth she'd found in the cache, tight enough to hold the packing in place without cutting circulation. He taught me many things. Said a healer's knowledge was more valuable than gold because gold couldn't save lives. I was supposed to take over his role in the community, be the next generation's link to old wisdom. Instead, I'm here using his teachings to keep alive a man who's probably going to get himself killed trying to protect me from consequences he doesn't understand. Tom heard the frustration in her voice, the guilt that mirrored his own feelings about Sarah, about failing to protect someone despite good intentions and desperate effort. I understand more than you think. I know what it's like to care about someone and watch them die because you weren't strong enough, smart enough, fast enough. I know how it feels to survive when they don't, how guilt becomes a constant companion that no amount of distance or time can shake. And I know that doing nothing when you could act as its own form of dying, just slower and less honest. Anya finished with his wound, sat back, her eyes meeting his in the gathering darkness of the ruined mission. What are you planning? And don't tell me you don't have a plan. Men like you always have plans, even when they're terrible and likely to get everyone killed. Tom almost smiled at her assessment, appreciating the dark humor despite their circumstances. I'm planning to stay alive long enough to figure out a better plan. Beyond that, I'm improvising. Kane wants you returned within 24 hours, but he also let us escape when he could have finished us. That suggests he's either arrogant enough to think we're not a real threat, or Thorne convinced him that the entertainment value of watching us struggle outweighs the pragmatic value of killing us immediately. He shifted position, trying to find an angle that didn't make his legs scream in protest. Either way, we've got a small window to act before they decide we're more trouble than we're worth. The question is, what action makes sense given our resources and limitations? Can't fight them directly? They've got numbers, weapons, home field advantage. Can't run forever. You're already exhausted and I'm injured badly enough that sustained travel isn't realistic. Can't appeal to law. Kane probably owns Marshall Collins, or at least has enough influence that official channels won't help. Ania pulled the blanket around her shoulders, her face thoughtful in the dimness. There's a fourth option. We take the fight to them, but not the way they expect. Kane's operation depends on fear and isolation on victims who don't fight back because they've been conditioned to believe resistance is futile. What if we break that conditioning, show the other women he's taken that escape is possible, that men like Kane aren't invulnerable? Tom considered this, turning the idea over in his mind, examining it from multiple angles. The strategy had appeal, hitting Kane where he'd least expect, disrupting his operation rather than just fleeing from it, turning the hunter's focus inward through internal chaos, rather than continuing to play the role of prey. But it was also dangerous, required capabilities Tom wasn't sure they possessed in their current state. Kane's ranch was 60 miles east, fortified, according to Anaya's earlier description, guarded by men who'd survived long enough in criminal enterprise to suggest competence beyond simple thuggery. How many women is Kane holding? Anaya's expression darkened, anger and grief mixing in equal measure. When I escaped, there were at least 15, maybe 20. Some recent captures, like me, but others who'd been there for months or longer. He keeps them in a converted barn locked at night, guarded during the day. Most have given up hope of rescue or escape, have accepted their situation as permanent, because the alternative, believing freedom is possible, but unreachable, is too painful to endure. 20 women represented leveraged potential allies if they could be motivated resources that Kane would prioritize protecting over hunting two fugitives. But they also represented complications, logistical challenges of moving and protecting people through hostile territory while being pursued by men with significantly more capability. 15 to 20 people who've been conditioned to helplessness, who don't know us and have no reason to trust we can deliver on promises of freedom. Some will be too traumatized to function. Some too physically damaged to travel. Some will actively resist out of fear that failed escape will bring worse punishment than compliance. We'd be lucky if half agreed to come, luckier still if more than a handful survived the attempt. Tom spoke harshly, not from cruelty, but from the necessity of honest assessment. Plans built on optimistic assumptions got people killed. Better to acknowledge worst-case scenarios and be pleasantly surprised than plan for best case and be unprepared when reality proved darker. Anaya didn't flinch from his assessment, had clearly thought through the same problems before suggesting the strategy. You're right that it's dangerous, that some won't make it, that we're gambling lives we don't have the right to risk. But doing nothing means those 20 women stay in Kane's barn until they're sold or broken or killed. At least this way, they get a choice, get one chance to decide for themselves whether freedom is worth the risk. The argument hit Tom in places he'd thought were numb, reopened questions about agency and choice that he'd struggled with since Sarah's death. She hadn't chosen to die, hadn't been given the option of trading her life for safety. Her death had been imposed through violence she couldn't prevent or escape. But these women Kane held, they were still alive, still capable of choice, even if that choice was between bad options and worse ones. Tom thought about his own decision 5 years ago to walk away from Silver Creek rather than become a murderer seeking revenge. That choice had felt right at the time, had aligned with principles Sarah had taught him about breaking cycles of violence. But sitting in these ruins, wounded and hunted, he understood with sudden clarity that walking away hadn't broken any cycles. It had just removed him from them, let the violence continue without his participation, but also without his opposition. Maybe the lesson wasn't about refusing violence categorically, but about choosing when and how to apply it, and about distinguishing between revenge and justice, between destruction for its own sake and destruction in service of something larger. If we do this, if we somehow manage to reach Kane's ranch and free those women, we're signing our own death warrants. Kane won't let that kind of disruption go unanswered. He'll hunt us across the entire territory, use every resource at his disposal, and he won't stop until we're dead or wish we were. Anaya met his gaze steadily, her dark eyes reflecting what little light penetrated the ruined mission. That was already true the moment you cut my chains. The only question is whether we die running and hiding, or whether we die making Kane's life so difficult that other people see opportunity in his weakness. Predators like him maintain power through the perception of invulnerability. Break that perception, and suddenly he's got problems beyond just us competitors who sense vulnerability, captives who see escape as possible, lawmen who might actually enforce the law if they think they can do it without committing suicide. Tom heard the strategic thinking beneath her words, recognized that Anaya was more than just a survivor, was someone who'd spent time analyzing the system that had captured her, looking for structural weaknesses that could be exploited. That level of thoughtful resistance spoke to qualities Tom respected, suggested that his initial assessment of her as someone worth protecting had been incomplete. She didn't need protection so much as partnership, collaboration between equals working toward shared goals. How far is the ranch from here? Practical question, beginning of actual planning rather than abstract discussion. Ania pulled the blanket tighter, her body language shifting from defensive to engaged. 60 miles almost due east. Kane chose the location specifically for its remoteness, far enough from established towns that screams don't carry close enough to territorial boundaries, that jurisdiction gets complicated if anyone does try to investigate. The ranch sits in a valley with only two practical approaches, both visible from high ground where Kane keeps watchers posted during daylight hours. Tom filed the information away, building mental maps considering angles of approach and avenues of retreat. 60 miles was manageable distance under normal circumstances, but with his injury and their lack of horses, it meant days of difficult travel through terrain Kane's men knew better than they did. Nighttime approach is essential. We'd need to get close during darkness, study their patterns, identify vulnerable points before committing to action. But that assumes we can travel 60 miles without being tracked, without Kane's men intercepting us before we even reach the ranch. Anya nodded, acknowledging the challenges without seeming daunted by them. The Henshaw brothers will track us eventually, but they're not infallible. I've avoided them before, used terrain and weather to obscure trails. It'll be harder with you injured, but possible if we're smart about it. Tom shifted position again, testing his leg's tolerance for weight. Pain flared immediately, sharp and insistent, confirming what he already knew. Any travel would be slow, agonizing, limited by his body's damage. But slow travel was still travel, still movement toward a goal, rather than passive waiting for enemies to find them. We rest tonight, let the wounds stabilize, let you recover some strength. Tomorrow we start moving east, cautious and low profile. We avoid contact with anyone. Don't take chances, prioritize staying hidden over making distance. If the leg gets worse, if infection sets in, we abandon the plan and focus on basic survival. Agreed. Anya extended her hand, the gesture formal and binding, despite their informal circumstances. Tom clasped it, felt the strength in her grip, the calluses that spoke to hard work and harder experiences. This wasn't a victim seeking rescue anymore. This was an ally, a partner in whatever came next, someone whose judgment and capability Tom trusted enough to stake his life on. They settled into uncomfortable rest as darkness claimed the mission ruins completely. Tom dozed fitfully, waking periodically to check their surroundings, to listen for sounds that might indicate pursuit or discovery. Each time he woke, he found Anya awake as well, keeping watch with the vigilance of someone who'd learned that sleep was a luxury you could only afford when someone you trusted was watching. Somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, Tom's fever spiked, infection beginning its inevitable work, despite Anya's herbal treatments. He burned and shivered simultaneously, his body waging war against contamination introduced by the bullet's passage through his flesh. Anya pressed water to his lips, kept him as comfortable as circumstances allowed, monitored his condition with the worried attention of someone who understood exactly how dangerous infection could be. Tom's mind wandered during the fever, mixing past and present into confused narratives where Sarah and Anya blurred together, where Silver Creek and Kane's ranch occupied the same geographic space, where choices he'd made 5 years ago could somehow be revisited and corrected. He knew these were hallucinations, fever dreams without substance or meaning, but understanding their unreality didn't make them less vivid or disturbing. Dawn arrived with Tom's fever broken, leaving him weak but clear-headed, his body having survived the first critical battle against infection. Anya looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she'd stayed awake through the entire night, refusing to rest, while his condition remained uncertain. "You should have woken me to take a watch." Tom's voice came out raspy, throat dry, despite the water she'd been giving him throughout the night. Anya helped him sit upright, supporting his back against the mission wall. "You were in no condition to keep watch. Besides, I'm used to going without sleep. Kane's barn wasn't conducive to rest, and after you've spent enough time learning to sleep with one eye open, normal sleep becomes difficult anyway." Tom understood that too. The way trauma rewired your nervous system, made genuine relaxation feel dangerous, turned rest into something you rationed rather than embraced. He'd struggled with it after Sarah died. Spent months where every noise jerked him awake, every shadow seemed to contain threats that dissolved under scrutiny, but left adrenaline residue that made returning to sleep impossible. "How's the leg?" Anya unwrapped his bandages, carefully examining the wound with critical attention. Tom looked down, saw swelling and discoloration that suggested his body was fighting infection. Actively saw drainage that smelled bad, but not yet putrid, that suggested battle lines were holding even if victory remained uncertain. Not good, but not as bad as it could be. The fever breaking is positive. If we can keep it clean, continue the herbal packing, the avoid stress that opens the wound, you might heal without permanent damage. But that's a lot of ifs. She rewrapped the leg with fresh strips torn from the blanket they'd shared, her movements confident, despite obvious exhaustion. Tom accepted her ministrations without protest, recognizing that maintaining his mobility was essential to any plan beyond passive hiding. Can I walk? Oh. Ania helped him stand, steadying him when his wounded leg threatened to buckle. Tom put weight on it, gradually testing tolerance, feeling pain, but not the catastrophic failure that would indicate structural damage beyond what inflammation and trauma could explain. You can walk, but not well and not far. 10 miles a day, maximum, probably less given terrain, and your need to avoid reopening the wound. That means 6 days minimum to reach Kane's ranch, assuming nothing goes wrong and infection doesn't get worse. 6 days felt like an eternity when enemies were actively hunting them, when every hour gave Kane's men more opportunity to establish search patterns to narrow the area where fugitives might hide. But wishes didn't change reality, and reality was that Tom's body had limitations that no amount of determination could overcome. They ate sparingly from the dried meat and water stores, preserving resources against uncertain future needs. The mission ruins offered limited supplies, suggested that whoever used this way station didn't keep it heavily provisioned, relied instead on travelers bringing their own necessities and contributing to communal stores when possible. Mid-morning brought sounds that made both Tom and Ania freeze hoofbeats, approaching from the south, multiple riders moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than aimless wandering. Tom grabbed the Winchester, positioned himself where he could see the mission entrance while maintaining cover behind crumbling adobe. Anya pressed herself against the opposite wall, the Colt held ready, her entire body tense with the anticipation of violence. They waited in silence, breathing shallow, listening as the hoofbeats grew closer, resolved into 3 distinct horses, then stopped just outside the mission walls. Voices carried through gaps in the structure, male and frustrated, discussing tracks and search patterns. Tom recognized one voice as belonging to Jacob Henshaw. The tracker Ania had mentioned could hear the professional assessment of someone reading sign that told stories most people couldn't see. Tracks lead here, then scatter. She knows what she's doing, covering her trail, using terrain to confuse the narrative. But look at this blood that's fresh within the last day arterial spray pattern suggests a significant wound. Whoever she's with won't be moving fast or far. Another voice, probably Jacob's brother Samuel, grunted agreement. So we check the mission, flush them out if they're here, expand the search if they're not. Simple enough. Tom's finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger, calculating angles, estimating his chances of hitting multiple moving targets while wounded and positioned awkwardly. The odds weren't good, but odds rarely were when you were outnumbered and compromised. Sometimes you played the hand you were dealt because folding meant dying anyway. But then a third voice intervened, this one unfamiliar but carrying authority that suggested higher rank or at least the confidence to challenge the Henshaw brothers' assessments. Thorne said to track but not engage. We're supposed to observe, report locations, let him decide when and how to make contact. You two go charging in there, you'll probably kill them, and then Thorne gets angry because you ruined his experiment. You want to deal with angry Thorne? The question seemed to settle the matter. Tom heard sounds of the riders moving away, hoofbeats, receding back toward the south, leaving the mission undisturbed. He stayed in position for another 10 minutes, making sure the retreat wasn't a feint, that they weren't waiting just out of sight for defenders to reveal themselves through premature relaxation. Finally satisfied the danger had passed, Tom lowered the rifle and released breath he'd been holding. Ananya emerged from her position, her face reflecting the same mixture of relief and concern Tom felt. They found us faster than I expected, and they're under orders not to engage, which means Thorne really is treating this as some kind of long-term observation, rather than simple recovery operation. Tom nodded, understanding the implications. They weren't being hunted in the traditional sense, were instead being studied, their movements tracked and cataloged, their choices monitored as data points in whatever psychological experiment Thorne had designed. The knowledge was simultaneously reassuring. They wouldn't be killed immediately and deeply unsettling because it meant Thorne's interest in them had escalated beyond simple curiosity into something more obsessive and potentially more dangerous. We can't stay here. They know we were here, will be watching to see where we go next. The mission's compromised as a refuge. Anaya gathered their meager supplies, preparing to move despite both of their bodies' clear need for more rest and recovery. Tom tested his leg again, accepted that pain would be his constant companion. For the foreseeable future began the mental process of compartmentalizing it, putting discomfort in a box where it could be acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate decision-making. Where do we go? Every direction is hostile territory. Every settlement potentially has Kane's informants. Every isolated location eventually gets found by trackers who are clearly better than we are. Ania's question was reasonable, demanded an answer Tom didn't have. They were fugitives without resources, wounded and exhausted, being tracked by professionals who'd let them escape, not from incompetence, but from orders, playing a game whose rules they didn't understand against an opponent whose motivations transcended normal criminal logic. Tom thought about redemption, about Marshall Collins, who probably wouldn't help but might at least represent neutral territory where Kane's men would be cautious about open violence. Thought about the territorial boundaries to the south where jurisdiction changed, and maybe, just maybe, they could find law enforcement that wasn't compromised by Kane's influence. But mostly he thought about the 20 women still held at Kane's ranch, about how every hour he spent fleeing and surviving was another hour they spent in captivity, about how his choice to save Anya had been meaningful precisely because it defied the logic of self-preservation that Thorne expected. We keep moving east, slower than planned, more careful, but still east toward Kane's ranch. If Thorne wants to watch what we do when pushed to extremes, let's give him something worth watching. Let's show him that some people don't break, they just get more determined. Anya stared at him like he'd suggested flying to the moon, her expression caught between admiration and concern. You're serious? Even wounded, even being tracked, even knowing it's probably suicide, you want to raid Kane's ranch and try to free women you've never met? Tom met her gaze steadily, found certainty in places he thought were empty. I'm serious. Because the alternative is running until we can't run anymore, hiding until we're found, surviving without purpose, until survival stops being worthwhile. At least this way we die doing something that matters, proving that Thorne's cynicism is wrong, that some people still choose differently, even when the cost is everything. They moved through broken country under a sky that held no mercy, the November sun bright but cold, offering light without warmth. Tom's leg throbbed with each step, a metronome of pain that measured progress in increments of suffering. He'd fashioned a crude walking stick from a cottonwood branch, using it to take weight off the wounded leg. But even with the assistance, movement felt like dragging his body through glass. Anya matched his pace without complaint, her attention divided between watching their back trail for pursuit and scanning ahead for terrain that might offer concealment or advantage. She moved with the efficiency of someone conserved energy, instinctively. No wasted motion, every step calculated for maximum progress with minimum cost. They traveled northeast rather than directly east, angling away from the most obvious route to Kane's ranch, betting that trackers would expect either evasion or direct approach, but not this oblique angle that added miles while potentially confusing pursuit. The terrain cooperated, offering a series of ravines and rocky outcrops that broke up their silhouette, made observation difficult from any significant distance. By midday, Tom's fever had returned, sweat soaking through his shirt. Despite the cold, his vision periodically swimming in ways that suggested infection was winning its war against his body's defenses. He pushed through it, understanding that stopping meant dying. That forward motion was the only real choice available, even when every cell screamed for rest. Ania called a halt in the shade of an overhanging rock formation, a place where they could rest briefly without being visible from above or from any direction except the narrow approach they'd used. She helped Tom lower himself to the ground, immediately checking his bandages, her expression tightening when she saw fresh blood seeping through fabric. The wound opened again. You're pushing too hard, tearing tissue that needs time to heal. Tom knew she was right, but couldn't see alternatives. Time was a luxury measured against Kane's patience, against infection's progression, against the 20 women still held at the ranch, whose suffering continued with each passing hour. We'll rest here for an hour, then keep moving. The bleeding will stop once I'm stationary, and we can't afford to lose daylight. Anya didn't argue, recognizing that Tom had moved beyond rational assessment into the territory of stubborn determination that couldn't be swayed by logic. Instead, she repacked the wound with fresh herbs, bound it tighter, gave him water and small pieces of dried meat that his stomach threatened to reject before grudgingly accepting. While Tom rested, Anya climbed to higher ground, scanning their surroundings with the kind of systematic attention that came from experience avoiding trackers. When she returned, her face carried news Tom didn't want to hear. Riders to the south may be 3 miles back. They're not rushing, just maintaining steady pace like they know exactly where we're going and aren't worried about losing us. The confirmation that they were being followed, being herded perhaps towards some predetermined location or confrontation, settled into Tom's awareness without surprise. Thorne had made his intentions clear. This wasn't about immediate capture, but about prolonged observation, about watching how prey responded to sustained pressure. Let them follow. As long as they don't engage, they're actually useful. They'll keep other threats away, create a buffer zone around us because they don't want anyone else interfering with Thorne's experiment. Anya considered this, saw the logic, even if she didn't like depending on enemies for anything resembling protection. That's a dangerous assumption. What if Thorne decides he's seen enough? What if his curiosity shifts from observation to vivisection? Valid concern one, Tom couldn't dismiss with false confidence. Thorne's psychology remained opaque, motivated by principles that didn't align with normal human behavior, making predictions about his actions essentially guesswork dressed as strategy. Then we deal with it when it happens. Right now, we focus on what we can control, getting to Cain's ranch, formulating a plan to free those women, executing before our wounds or our luck runs out. They resumed traveling after less than the promised hour, Tom's impatience overriding his body's clear need for more rest. The afternoon stretched into evening shadows, lengthening across broken ground, temperature dropping as the sun approached the western horizon. They covered perhaps 8 miles, better than Tom had feared, but less than the situation demanded progress measured against impossible standards. Darkness forced a halt in a shallow cave, little more than an indentation in a rock face, but enough to provide shelter from wind and concealment from casual observation. Tom collapsed immediately, his body shutting down, systems non-essential to survival, conserving energy for the ongoing fight against infection and exhaustion. Anya took first watch, positioning herself where she could see anyone approaching while remaining mostly hidden. Tom tried to stay awake to share the burden of vigilance, but fever and fatigue combined to drag him under despite intentions. His dreams were vivid, fevered narratives that mixed memory with hallucination. Sarah was there, alive and whole, teaching children to read in a Silver Creek schoolhouse that became Cain's barn, her students transforming into the captive women Anya had described. Tom tried to warn her, tried to explain that danger was coming, but his voice wouldn't work, words dying in his throat before they could form warnings. Then the scene shifted, and he was standing in a courtroom again, watching Callahan's son smirk as the judge dismissed charges, as justice failed the way it always failed when money and power conspired against truth. But this time, Tom didn't walk away. This time, he pulled his revolver and shot everyone in the courtroom. Judge and jury and lawyers and defendants kept shooting until the hammer fell on empty chambers and blood-covered marble floors. Sarah appeared again, standing in the carnage, her face disappointed rather than afraid. "This isn't breaking cycles, Thomas. This is just you becoming part of the violence you claim to oppose." Tom tried to explain that some violence was necessary, that protecting people required willingness to hurt those who would hurt them, that there was a difference between revenge and justice, even if the bullets looked the same. But Sarah was gone, replaced by Daniel Thorne, who clapped slowly, sarcastically, as if Tom's dream murders were a performance staged for his amusement. "You're more interesting than I thought. Most people can't admit what they want, dress it up in noble language, pretend they're different. But deep down, you understand. Violence is the only real answer. Everything else is just delay." Tom woke with Anya's hand on his shoulder, her face close to his, concerned and alert. "You were talking in your sleep, saying names, arguing with someone who wasn't there." Morning light filtered into the cave, pale and cold. Tom's fever had broken again during the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed, his body having survived another round in its ongoing war against infection. Fever dreams. Nothing important. But even as he said it, Tom knew the dreams had been important, had crystallized questions he'd been avoiding, about motivation and morality, about whether his desire to help Anya and the other captive women was genuinely altruistic or just revenge against Cain disguised as rescue. Did it matter? If the outcome was the same, women freed Cain's operation, disrupted justice delivered in the absence of legal mechanisms, did his internal motivation change the moral calculus? Tom didn't know, suspected. The question didn't have simple answers, decided that philosophical certainty was another luxury he couldn't afford. Sometimes you acted because action was necessary, and you sorted out the ethical implications later if you survived long enough for later to arrive. They ate a sparse breakfast, conserving supplies that wouldn't last much longer, regardless of rationing. Tom's wound had stopped bleeding overnight, though the flesh around it looked angry and swollen, suggested his body was fighting hard, but maybe not winning. Another day, maybe two, before infection progressed beyond what herbal treatments could manage. After that, he'd need proper medical care, or the wound would kill him as surely as any bullet. The arithmetic was simple, brutal, unavoidable. They had perhaps 40 miles left to cover, and Tom's body had maybe 4 days before it stopped cooperating. That meant 10 miles per day every day, without rest or delay or complications. The margin for error was non-existent. The timeline unforgiving, the whole enterprise balanced on assumptions about endurance and luck that Tom knew were optimistic at best. Tell me about Cain's ranch. Layout, defenses, guard rotations, anything that helps me understand what we're walking into. They moved while Anya talked her descriptions, building a mental picture of the target, identifying vulnerabilities that might be exploited, recognizing strengths that demanded respect. The main house sits on high ground, overlooks the valley. Cain lives there with his officers Thorne Cutler, when he was alive, the Henshaw brothers. Below that is the barn, where they keep the captive women converted from actual livestock use to human storage. Guard shack between the barn and the main house, usually 2 men rotating 4-hour shifts. Beyond that bunkhouse, for the regular crew, maybe a dozen men who do the actual ranch work and provide muscle when Cain needs it. Tom absorbed the information, building tactical pictures. Understanding that any assault would need to account for multiple defensive layers, that surprise would be essential because sustained combat against superior numbers was suicide. Access routes. Ania pointed northeast toward a ridgeline visible in the distance. The valley has 3 ways in. Main road from the south, wide and easy, also completely visible from the main house. Eastern approach through a narrow canyon, difficult terrain, but concealed until you're almost on top of the buildings. Western route is gentle slopes, good for cattle but bad for stealth because there's no cover. Tom filed away the information and recognized that the eastern approach through the canyon was their only realistic option. Understood that Cain would know this too, would have positioned defenses accordingly. What about the barn itself? How's it secured? Heavy doors with exterior locks at night. During the day, the doors stay open, but guards are posted. Windows are small, barred, designed to prevent escape. But the roof, there's a hayloft access that's not as secure. That's how I got out the second time, climbed through the hayloft and dropped from the roof at night when the guards were rotating. Tom noted the vulnerability, began sketching a plan that involved accessing the barn from above, freeing the captives, while guards were distracted, creating enough chaos that Cain's numerical advantage became a liability rather than an asset. But the plan had problems, required capabilities they didn't have, assumed cooperative weather and luck and timing that aligned perfectly. It was the kind of strategy that looked reasonable on paper and fell apart immediately upon contact with reality. They covered 10 miles that day through sheer stubbornness, Tom driving himself past reasonable limits, accepting that permanent damage was preferable to failure. His leg had gone from throbbing to a constant fire that consumed thought, made him nauseous, turned the world into a narrow tunnel where only forward motion mattered. Anya supported him through the worst of it, became his crutch when the walking stick wasn't enough, shared her strength when his depleted past recovery. She didn't tell him to stop, didn't suggest retreat or delay, understood that Tom had committed fully to this course and would see it through regardless of cost. That night they sheltered in a dry wash, exhaustion overriding caution, neither of them capable of maintaining meaningful vigilance. Tom's fever returned with renewed vigor, his body's defenses finally overwhelmed by days of stress and insufficient treatment. He burned and shivered, consciousness drifting in and out of coherence, time becoming fluid and unreliable. Anya stayed with him through the Chris's pressed water to his lips, kept him as warm as their meager blanket allowed, monitored his breathing and pulse with the kind of grim focus that suggested she understood how close to dying he actually was. Somewhere in the deepest part of the night, Tom surfaced from fever dreams to find Anya sitting beside him, her hand on his forehead, her face drawn with exhaustion and worry. "You're not going to make it to the ranch. Not like this." Her voice carried resignation, acknowledgement of facts she'd been trying to ignore but could no longer deny. Tom wanted to argue, to insist that he'd keep moving through Will alone if necessary, but his body betrayed him. Refused to respond to commands demonstrated through complete depletion that determination had limits. "Leave me here. Take the rifle, what's left of the supplies. Get to the ranch yourself. Free whoever you can tell them." Thomas Wade tried to help even if he failed. The suggestion came out weak, barely audible, but carried sincerity. Tom understood his usefulness had ended, that he'd become a liability rather than an asset, that Ania's chances improved if she wasn't dragging a dying man across hostile territory. But Ania shook her head, her expression set in lines that suggested she'd already considered and rejected that option. "I'm not leaving you. You didn't leave me when it would have been easier, safer, smarter. I'm extending the same courtesy." Tom tried to explain that the situations weren't comparable, that he'd saved her from immediate danger, whereas she would be sacrificing herself for someone already dying. But the words wouldn't come, got lost somewhere between intention and articulation. He drifted back into fever, into dreams that were darker now, more final. Sarah appeared again, but distant, receding, her voice calling him towards something that might have been death, or might have been rest, or might have been the same thing. Tom tried to follow, wanted to follow, but something held him back, anchored him to consciousness and suffering, and the ongoing fight his body was losing. When he woke again, the fever had broken with a finality that suggested either his body had won its war or had lost it and was simply shutting down in stages. Sunlight filtered through morning haze, revealing landscape he didn't immediately recognize, suggesting Anya had moved him during the night, dragged or carried him to some location he couldn't remember reaching. "You moved me." Statement of obvious fact, confusion making sophisticated observation impossible. Anya appeared in his field of vision, her face showing strain, but also something like relief. "You needed better shelter. This place has water, some protection, better chance of keeping you alive than an open wash bed." Tom looked around, saw they were in what appeared to be an old line shack, probably abandoned for years, but still structurally sound, offering walls and a roof and crude furniture that included an actual bed frame minus mattress, but infinitely better than bare ground. "How far did you carry me?" Ania's smile was tired but genuine. "Not as far as you think, maybe a quarter-mile. You helped more than you probably remember, walked when I needed you to walk, even if you don't recall doing it." The gap in Tom's memory troubled him, suggested his condition had deteriorated past the point where he could form coherent narratives of experience. But he was alive, conscious, and apparently in better shelter than he'd had any right to expect. "How long was I out?" Anya settled onto the floor near the bed frame, her own exhaustion evident in the way she moved, careful and pained. "Most of a day and night. Your fever broke around dawn, finally stayed broken. The wound looks slightly better, or at least not actively worse. I found some different herbs near the water source plants my father taught me about that are stronger than what we've been using. They burn like fire when applied, but they kill infection more effectively." Tom touched his leg, felt fresh bandaging remembered through the haze of fever, a sensation of pain so intense it had pulled him briefly to consciousness before letting him sink back into darkness. "You probably saved my life." The acknowledgement felt inadequate, couldn't capture the full weight of debt he owed for her refusal to abandon him, when abandonment would have been the logical choice. Anaya waved off the gratitude, uncomfortable with recognition she clearly didn't think she deserved. "You saved mine first. We're even. Now we focus on what comes next, because resting here is safe for maybe one more day before someone finds us. The Henshaw brothers are still out there, still tracking, and this shack is too obvious a shelter for them to miss it during their search pattern." Tom pushed himself upright, despite his body's protest, tested his leg, gingerly found it could support weight without immediate collapse, though pain remained intense. Better than he'd feared, worse than he needed, somewhere in the middle ground where he could function if he accepted that every movement would hurt. How far to Kane's ranch? Anya moved to the shack's single window, looked out across terrain that Tom couldn't see from his position on the bedframe. 20 miles, maybe 25. Close enough that we could reach it in 2 days if you can walk closer to 3 or 4 if we need to go slow and careful. 2 days. Tom's body had maybe that much left before infection or exhaustion or the cumulative effects of pushing too hard had caused catastrophic failure. The timeline had tightened to nothing, eliminated all cushion, demanded that everything go perfectly from here forward, or the entire enterprise collapsed. Then we move tomorrow. Today we rest, eat what's left of our supplies, prepare as best we can. Tomorrow we cover as much ground as possible, get close enough to observe the ranch, finalize our approach. The day after we act. Anya turned from the window, her expression skeptical. You can barely walk. You want to raid a fortified ranch, fight trained men, rescue 20 traumatized women, all while wounded and sick and outnumbered. 20-1. Tom heard the doubt in her voice, understood it came from reasonable assessment rather than cowardice or lack of commitment. I know the odds. I know how likely we are to fail, to die trying to make everything worse instead of better. But I also know that doing nothing guarantees those women stay in Kane's barn, that Thorne continues his experiments on human suffering, that evil wins through the passivity of good people who decide the cost of opposition is too high. He paused, gathering strength for words that felt important beyond their immediate context. 5 years ago, I watched Sarah die because I wasn't willing to kill the men responsible. I told myself it was principle that breaking the cycle of violence required restraint, that becoming a murderer made me no better than them. But what I really was, what I've been ever since, is a coward who chose comfort over justice. Anya sat on the floor near the bed frame, listening with the kind of attention that suggested she understood this confession mattered, that Tom was speaking truths he'd never articulated before. Finding you chained to my fence gave me a chance at something I thought was lost, the opportunity to choose differently, to prove that people can act against their self-interest when something larger is at stake. I'm not trying to redeem Sarah's death or earn forgiveness for my failures. I'm trying to demonstrate to myself as much as to Thorne that humans are capable of nobility even when the cost is everything. The words hung in the still air of the line shack confession and manifesto and prayer all mixed together. Anya absorbed them without immediate response, her dark eyes studying Tom's face, searching for something she apparently found satisfactory. Then we do it together, not because the odds are good, not because we'll probably survive, but because you're right that some things matter more than survival. My father taught me that a healer's duty isn't to preserve life at all costs, but to reduce suffering, even when reduction means different things to different people. Sometimes reducing suffering requires taking lives that exist solely to inflict pain on others. Tom felt something shift between them, a recognition of shared purpose that transcended their initial relationship of rescuer and rescued. They were partners, now equals in commitment, if not capability. Two damaged people who'd found in each other's brokenness something worth fighting for. They spent the rest of that day preparing, such as preparation was possible, given their limited resources. Tom cleaned and checked the Winchester-counted ammunition that remained depressingly limited, 23 rounds plus the 6 in Anya's Colt, barely enough for sustained combat against multiple opponents. Anya scouted the immediate area, found a creek that provided fresh water, located plants that could be eaten, if not enjoyed, returned with the information about the terrain between their shelter and Kane's ranch. As evening approached, they ate their last substantial meal, understanding that from here forward they'd be operating on reserves that were already depleted, pushing bodies past reasonable limits because the alternative was surrender. Tom laid out what passed for a plan, acknowledging its weaknesses while defending its necessity. We approach from the east through the canyon you mentioned. We wait until full dark after the guards have rotated and settled into the boredom of night watch. We access the barn through the hayloft, same route you used to escape. Once inside, we wake the women, explain quickly. Give them the choice to come or stay. He paused, considering the hardest part. Some will be too afraid to move, too conditioned to helplessness. Some will want to come but won't be physically capable. Some might actively resist out of fear that failed escape will bring worse punishment. We take whoever is willing and able, leave the others with whatever supplies we can spare, and move fast before Kane realizes what's happening. Anya nodded, seeing the same problems Tom did, but offering no better alternatives. Once we're clear of the barn, where do we go? 20 women traveling together will be visible, slow, easy to track. Cain will pursue and we can't fight him effectively while protecting that many people. Tom had thought about this, recognized it as the fundamental weakness in any rescue plan. We split up. I'll stay behind, provide cover draw, pursuit, while you lead the women away. I can hold a defensive position for a few hours, maybe longer. Give you time to get far enough away that Cain has to choose between pursuing me and pursuing them. Anaya's expression hardened, anger flashing across her features. That's not a plan, that's suicide dressed up as tactics. You're wounded, sick, low on ammunition. You won't last an hour against Cain's full crew. Tom didn't disagree with her assessment, had already made peace with what his role would cost. Maybe not, but an hour is enough if you use it well, if you get the women far enough away that Cain can't easily track them. Besides, I'm the one Thorne is interested in. He wants to see what I do when pushed to extremes. Let's give him a show worth watching. They argued about it for another hour, Anya proposing variations that didn't end with Tom sacrificing himself, Tom explaining why those variations wouldn't work, why someone had to stay behind, why that someone had to be him rather than her. Eventually, Anya accepted what Tom had known from the beginning, that survival wasn't the goal, that success meant freeing the captive women regardless of cost to the rescuers, that some debts could only be paid in blood. Night fell cold and absolute clouds obscuring stars, darkness so complete that Tom couldn't see his hand in front of his face. Good weather for what they planned, and assuming they could navigate in the dark without breaking necks on terrain they had only seen in daylight. They left the line shack with the understanding that they wouldn't return. That forward motion from this point was one-way, committed, irrevocable. Tom's leg had stiffened. During rest, protested violently when he put weight on it, eventually accepted its role in movement, with the grudging cooperation of tissue that knew it was damaged but would function until something catastrophic failed. Progress was slow, measured in careful steps rather than miles, hands extended to feel obstacles before colliding with them, pausing frequently to listen for sounds that might indicate pursuit or discovery. The darkness was both ally and enemy, concealing their movement while making navigation nearly impossible. Hours passed, measured in incremental progress and growing exhaustion. Tom's fever threatened to return multiple times, pushed back through will, and Anya's vigilance hovering at the edges of consciousness like a predator waiting for weakness to overwhelm resistance. Somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, they crested a ridge and saw below them the valley Anya had described, saw lights from Cain's ranch scattered and dim, suggesting either everyone was asleep or guards were maintaining minimal illumination to preserve night vision. The buildings resolved into the layout Anya had outlined: main house on high ground, barn, and outbuildings below, the whole complex laid out with defensive logic that recognized vulnerability and minimized it. Tom studied the terrain, committing details to memory, looking for the Eastern Canyon approach, identifying where guards might be posted, calculating angles and distances that would matter when everything went loud. The canyon entrance is there about a mile northeast. We follow the ridge around, drop into the canyon floor, use it to get close without being seen. If we time it right, we'll reach the barn just before dawn, when guards are tired and attention is lowest. Anaya nodded, her face barely visible in the darkness, just a shape and suggestion of features. Once we're in the barn, how long do we have before someone notices? Tom considered, gaming out scenarios based on assumptions about guard attentiveness and routine. Maybe 10 minutes if we're lucky, less if someone makes noise or panics. We'll need to move fast, communicate clearly, get the women mobilized and moving before Cain can organize a response. They started down the ridge, using darkness for cover, sacrificing speed for stealth, understanding that discovery before they reached the barn meant failure before they even attempted the rescue. Tom's leg threatened to give out multiple times, was caught and supported by Anya, who'd positioned herself where she could help without making assistance obvious or demeaning. The canyon entrance was exactly where Anya had indicated, a narrow cut through rock that water had carved over, millennia steep walls on both sides that blocked sightlines, creating a corridor that led almost to Cain's barn before opening into the valley proper. They moved through the canyon in absolute silence, every sound amplified by acoustics that turned footsteps into thunder, turned breathing into wind, made stealth feel impossible despite the overwhelming darkness. Tom's heart hammered against his ribs, adrenaline fighting exhaustion, body preparing for violence, even as it questioned whether it could deliver. The canyon opened onto the valley floor 50 yards from the barn, close enough that Tom could see the building's outline against slightly less dark sky, could make out the guard shack between barn and main house, could identify the path they'd need to follow to reach the hayloft access Anya had used for her escape, and could see standing directly in their path the silhouette of Daniel Thorne, as if he'd been waiting for them, expecting them, anticipating exactly where and when they'd arrive. Thorne's voice carried across the darkness, conversational and amused, as if he were greeting old friends rather than confronting people who'd traveled days to destroy his employer's operation. "Thomas Wade, you made it farther than I calculated. Most men with your injuries would have died in that mission ruin, or at least had the sense to crawl away and find a doctor. But you kept coming, kept pushing, kept choosing the harder path when easier ones presented themselves." Tom raised the Winchester, knowing even as he did that Thorne had positioned himself deliberately, had orchestrated this encounter to happen exactly here, exactly now for reasons that served his twisted curiosity rather than tactical necessity. "Let us pass." Simple demand, no threat, no negotiation. Tom's strength was nearly depleted, his body operating on fumes and desperation, but his voice carried certainty that transcended physical capability. Thorne stepped closer, hands visible and empty, posture relaxed despite facing an armed man who had every reason to kill him. "I could. In fact, I'm going to. But first I want you to understand what you're actually doing here, what this grand gesture costs beyond your own life." He gestured toward the barn, its bulk barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. 23 women in that barn. You free them, lead them away. Kane loses a significant investment. He'll be angry, violent, will probably kill you slowly for the insult. But here's what you haven't considered. Those women go back to communities that were already unable to protect them. Kane learns from this failure, adjusts his security, and within 6 months he's captured 40 women to replace the 20 you freed. Your noble sacrifice accomplishes nothing except multiplying suffering. Tom felt the logic of Thorne's argument, recognized the kernel of truth wrapped in manipulative presentation. Saving individuals didn't address systemic problems, didn't change the power dynamics that allowed men like Kane to operate with impunity. But system-level change required resources, time, political will that Tom didn't possess and couldn't generate. All he had was this moment in these women, this chance to demonstrate that resistance was possible even if victory remained elusive. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm just creating worse problems down the road. But those women get to choose live under Kane's control or take their chances with freedom. That choice matters even if the outcome is worse, because autonomy has value independent of results. Thorne's smile widened, genuine pleasure evident even in darkness. "Fascinating. You understand the limits of your actions but proceed anyway. That's true moral courage, rare enough that I genuinely want to see how far it extends. So go ahead, free the women, play out your heroic fantasy. I'll watch from a comfortable distance and collect data on how humans behave when idealism collides with reality." He stepped aside, clearing the path to the barn, his gesture expansive and mocking. "Oh, and you should know Kane's in redemption tonight, meeting with Marshal Collins about expanding operations. He took most of his crew, left only a skeleton guard here because he didn't expect anyone stupid enough to attack his home base. You might actually succeed, at least in the short term. Isn't that exciting?" The information was too convenient, too perfectly aligned with what Tom needed to hear, which meant it was either a trap or Thorne's idea of experimental design, removing variables to isolate the specific behaviors he wanted to observe. Tom didn't waste time trying to parse Thorne's motivations. He moved past the man rifle trained on him until distance made continuing to aim pointless, then shifted focus to the barn and the immediate challenge of accessing it without alerting whoever remained on guard duty. Anaya followed close behind her, breathing controlled, but rapid adrenaline and fear mixing in equal measure. When they'd put sufficient distance between themselves and Thorne, she whispered urgently, "That was a trap. He let us pass for a reason." Tom nodded, having reached the same conclusion. "Doesn't matter. Trap or not, those women are still in that barn, still need freeing. We adapt to whatever comes." They reached the barn's eastern wall, pressing against weathered wood, listening for sounds inside. Nothing obvious, no voices, no movement, just the ambient noise of a structure that housed living beings, the subtle shifts in breathing that people made even in sleep. The hayloft access Aeneas had used was 10 feet above ground level, a simple door designed for loading hay bales during harvest. A ladder leaned against the wall nearby, either left carelessly by workers or positioned deliberately by someone who anticipated this exact approach. Tom tested the ladder's stability, found it solid, began climbing with his rifle slung across his back using mostly his good leg, while the wounded one provided minimal support. Pain flared with each movement, his body screaming protests that Tom ignored through practiced compartmentalization. The hayloft door opened with a creak that seemed catastrophically loud in the pre-dawn silence. Tom froze, waiting for shouts or gunfire for evidence that the noise had alerted guards. Nothing came. Either no one had heard or Thorne's information had been accurate and the barn was minimally guarded. Inside the loft was mostly empty hay stores depleted by season and used, leaving open space and a ladder leading down to the main floor. Tom descended carefully, his night-adjusted eyes picking out shapes below, women sleeping on rough pallets, huddled together for warmth, their presence confirmed by the rise and fall of breathing, by the occasional shift of restless sleep. Aeneas dropped down beside him, moved immediately toward the nearest woman, touching her shoulder, gently covering her mouth before she could scream in startled fear. Tom saw the woman's eyes go wide in the darkness, saw recognition as Aeneas whispered something too quiet for Tom to hear, saw the shift from terror to desperate hope. Others were waking now, alerted by the disturbance, by presence of people who shouldn't be there. Tom moved among them quickly, keeping his voice low but urgent. "We're here to help. You have maybe 10 minutes to decide, come with us now or stay here. No judgment either way. No promises beyond the chance to run. But you need to choose now." The women stared at him with expressions Tom recognized from his martial days, the particular hopelessness of people who'd been promised rescue before and found only new variations of betrayal. They didn't trust him, didn't believe him, had learned through bitter experience that men who appeared in the night rarely brought anything good. But Anaya's presence changed the calculus. They knew her, had shared captivity with her, understood that she wouldn't return voluntarily to the place she'd escaped. Her return meant this wasn't a trap, or at least wasn't an obvious one, gave them permission to hope that maybe possibly this time was different. One woman stood older than the others, her face scarred by violence or disease or both. She spoke quietly but with authority that suggested leadership earned through survival rather than appointed. "How many guards?" Tom appreciated the practical assessment, the immediate focus on tactical reality rather than emotional response. "We don't know. Possibly just 2, maybe more. We came in through the loft, haven't seen anyone yet, but that could change any second." The older woman turned to address the others, her voice carrying clearly despite its low volume. "This is probably our only chance. Maybe it's a trap, maybe we all die trying. But I've been here 4 months and I can tell you with certainty that staying means dying slowly. I'd rather die fast doing something than slow doing nothing." Her speech galvanized the group, broke through the paralysis of fear, gave permission for action. Women began standing, gathering minimal possessions, organizing themselves with surprising efficiency given the chaos of the situation. Tom counted quickly, 19 women, total one fewer than Anya had estimated, probably dead or sold or simply lost in the brutal arithmetic of Kane's operation. 19 people who would need to move quickly through hostile territory while being pursued by men who had every reason to hunt them down. The barn door burst open before Tom could formulate the next step, admitting morning light and 3 guards who'd apparently been alerted by noise or routine check or simple bad luck. They took in the scene, armed man among the captives, women standing instead of sleeping, the clear preparation for escape, and reached for weapons with the instinctive speed of people who survived through quick violence. Tom fired the Winchester from his hip, not aiming carefully but suppressing, sending rounds toward the doorway fast enough to make the guards dive for cover. Return fire came immediately. Muzzle flashes bright in the dim barn, bullets impacting wood and dirt, forcing Tom and the women to scatter. Chaos erupted, women screaming and running in all directions, guards shooting and shouting for backup. Tom working the Winchester's lever mechanically, putting rounds down range to maintain pressure, to prevent the guards from advancing into the barn where they could corner everyone. One guard went down, caught by Tom's bullet, or maybe just stumbling. Tom couldn't tell in the confusion. The other two retreated outside, using the doorframe as cover, calling for reinforcements that would arrive any second and transform this situation from manageable to catastrophic. Ania appeared at Tom's side, the Colt in her hand, her face set in determined lines. The back wall, there's a loose board the guards don't know about. We can get the women out that way while you keep the front occupied. Tom nodded, understanding the division of labor. Recognizing that his mobility was too compromised to lead people through escape routes, but adequate for holding a defensive position temporarily. Go, I'll hold here as long as I can. Anaya grabbed his arm, her grip fierce. Don't die, stupid. When you can't hold any more, run. Find us later. She was gone before Tom could explain that running wasn't part of his plan, that holding this position meant staying until ammunition ran out, or the guards overwhelmed him, or his wounded leg finally gave out completely. Some debts required payment in full, some promises couldn't be kept without sacrifice. Tom repositioned to better cover the barn entrance, used hay bales and support posts for protection, fired carefully now that the initial chaos had passed, making each round count against the limited ammunition remaining. Outside, he heard raised voices, sounds of men organizing, preparing for assault rather than hasty attack. The women were filing through the back wall escape route, Anaya directing them with urgent whispers, getting them clear before Kane's men regrouped. Tom counted seconds, estimated how long before the guards outside would realize the defenders were escaping, how long he could hold their attention, focused on the front entrance. Not long enough. The answer was never long enough when you were one wounded man against multiple opponents, who'd soon understand the tactical situation and adjust accordingly. But Tom had known this from the beginning, had accepted that his role in this operation would end here, that success meant the women escaped, while he provided the distraction that made escape possible. Sarah would have disapproved, would have argued that sacrificing himself didn't honor her memory or prove any meaningful principle. But Sarah was dead killed by men who'd escaped justice through systemic corruption, and Tom had spent 5 years learning that sometimes the only response to injustice was direct action regardless of personal cost. A figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by dawn light, silhouette recognizable even without details. Marcus Kane returned from redemption earlier than Thorne had suggested, or maybe this was part of Thorne's design all along, another variable introduced to test how Tom responded under escalating pressure. Kane's voice carried clearly into the barn calm, despite the situation authority absolute. Thomas Wade, you've made a series of very poor choices, destroyed valuable property, killed one of my men. I'm willing to end this without more bloodshed if you surrender now. Come out, hands visible. I promise you'll die quick instead of slow. Tom didn't bother responding, had nothing to say to men like Kane, no common language that would bridge the gap between their worldviews. He checked his ammunition, 7 rounds in the Winchester, maybe 5 minutes before the guards found the back exit and realized the captives were escaping. 5 minutes to hold, to buy time to demonstrate that some people still chose resistance when surrender would be easier. He fired through the doorway, forcing Kane to duck back, maintaining pressure that prevented immediate assault. Return fire came heavier now. Multiple rifles, coordinated rounds punching through the barn's wooden walls, raising dust and splinters, filling the air with the smell of cordite and fear. Tom moved positions, constantly staying low, using terrain as cover, making himself difficult to pin down. His leg protested every movement, threatened to give out, was kept functional through will alone. He'd stopped feeling pain distinctly, had moved past it, into a place where sensation registered, but didn't matter where his body was, just a tool to be used until it broke. 4 rounds left. 3, 2. Tom made each shot count, placed them carefully to maintain the illusion that the barn was still defended by someone dangerous enough to warrant caution. Outside, he heard Kane organizing a coordinated assault, multiple angles, simultaneously overwhelming firepower that would end this quickly once deployed. 1 round remaining. Tom positioned himself where he could see both the front entrance and the back exit the women had used, ensured that when Kane's men breached, they'd have to pass through his line of fire, would pay at least some cost for their victory. The barn doors burst open from multiple directions simultaneously, guards rushing in with weapons raised, spreading to cover all angles, professional entry that spoke to training and experience. Tom got one of them, maybe 2. His final shot and Ania's earlier work with the Colt accounting for bodies that fell, but then return fire found him, bullets impacting his shoulder and chest, spinning him around, driving him to the ground. Pain exploded through Tom's body, overwhelming the numbness that had sustained him, making consciousness difficult to maintain. He heard boots approaching, felt hands grabbing him roughly, dragging him outside into morning light that seemed impossibly bright after the barn's dimness. Kane stood over him, his bearded face expressing something between rage and grudging respect. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I haven't decided which." Tom tried to respond, found his voice wouldn't work, blood filling his throat, making speech impossible. His vision was narrowing, darkness creeping in from the edges, his body shutting down, systems it couldn't maintain, preparing for the end that Tom had accepted as probable from the moment he'd found Anya chained to his fence. But before consciousness left completely, Tom saw something that brought fierce satisfaction. Despite the pain, the barn empty behind Kane, the women gone escaped while he'd held attention focused on the wrong entrance. Success measured not in survival, but in lives saved and choices honored, in proving that some people still acted against self-interest when principle demanded it. Kane followed Tom's gaze, understanding dawning as he realized what had happened during the firefight. His expression shifted to fury recognition that he'd been outmaneuvered by a dying man and a group of traumatized women. "Find them, all of them. I want them back by sunset or you're all fired." His men scattered, leaving Tom bleeding in the dirt, apparently not worth the bullet to finish quickly. Thorne appeared from somewhere, crouched beside Tom with clinical interest, studying his wounds with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment's conclusion. "You really did it. Sacrificed yourself for people you'd never met, proved that humans can transcend self-preservation when properly motivated. That's valuable data, Thomas. Your death serves science, if not justice." Tom wanted to tell Thorne exactly what he could do with his data, and his experiments wanted to explain that reducing human choice to observable phenomena amidst the entire point of consciousness and morality. But he lacked the strength, lacked the voice, lacked everything except the slowly fading awareness that he'd done what he set out to do, that 19 women had a chance because he'd been willing to pay the price for their freedom. Darkness claimed him, then complete and final, pulling him down into depths where pain couldn't follow, where Sarah's voice called him toward rest he'd denied himself for 5 years. Consciousness returned in fragments, pieces of awareness that didn't initially cohere into understanding. Pain first constant and overwhelming, suggesting Tom's body was still alive, even if he wasn't sure why. Voices next distant and distorted, speaking words Tom couldn't parse. Finally, vision blurry and incomplete, showing wooden beams above him, unfamiliar ceiling, that suggested he'd been moved from where he fell. Memory assembled slowly, the barn, the fight getting shot multiple times, watching Kane's realization that the women had escaped. Tom tried to sit up, found his body wouldn't respond, was restrained, somehow bound to whatever surface he was lying on. A face appeared above him, resolving into Daniel Thorne, his expression carrying that same unsettling curiosity Tom had seen every time they'd encountered each other. "Welcome back. You've been unconscious for about 6 hours. Kane wanted to let you bleed out, but I convinced him you were worth keeping alive, at least temporarily. I have more questions, you see, about what drives men like you to such extreme self-sacrifice." Tom's voice came out as barely a whisper, throat raw from blood and screaming he didn't remember. The women, Thorne's smile was genuine, almost warm, as if Tom had asked exactly the question he had hoped to hear. "Gone. Scattered into the territory, probably splitting up to make tracking difficult. Kane's men found 3 of them, but the others are still free. You accomplished your goal. Thomas saved most of the people you set out to save. Congratulations." The words should have brought satisfaction, but Tom heard something underneath them. Some implication that complicated the simple narrative of successful rescue. "What's the cut? What did I miss?" Thorne stood, walked to a window. Tom couldn't see, spoke with his back turned. "Kane's furious, of course. Losing that many women simultaneously represents a significant financial setback, not to mention the embarrassment of being outmaneuvered by one dying man. He's putting bounties on all the escaped women high enough that every drifter and criminal in 3 territories will be hunting them. Most will be recaptured within a month, returned to conditions worse than they left." Tom felt the weight of those advice, understood the truth in Thorne's earlier warning that individual rescue didn't address systemic problems, that saving people from one captor just made them targets for others. "Why am I alive? Why didn't Kane just kill me?" Thorne turned back, his expression carrying something Tom couldn't identify. Might have been respect, or might have been something darker. Because I paid him your value. You're my property now, Thomas purchased legally according to territorial commerce laws. I own you the same way Cain owned those women, the same way Sarah's killers owned her. How does that feel, experiencing the powerlessness you've spent 5 years thinking about? The revelation hit Tom harder than the bullets had. Understanding that he'd traded his life not for the women's freedom, but for temporary escape that would likely end in their recapture, and had himself become exactly what he'd tried to prevent: property owned by someone who viewed people as subjects for experimentation rather than beings deserving dignity. What do you want from me? Thorne pulled a chair close to where Tom was restrained, settled into it comfortably. Conversation, mostly. I want to understand what happened in your mind during each decision point, when you found Anya chained, when you chose to defend rather than surrender, when you attacked Cain's ranch despite being wounded and outnumbered. I want to map the neural pathways that override survival instinct in favor of abstract principle. Tom understood then what Thorne intended, recognized that he'd become a permanent research subject, that whatever time remained in his life would be spent satisfying the curiosity of a sociopath who viewed human suffering as data to be collected rather than tragedy to be prevented. The irony was bitter. Tom had sacrificed himself to prove that people could choose nobility over self-preservation, and that choice had resulted in becoming property himself, demonstrating in the cruelest possible way that good intentions and brave actions didn't guarantee meaningful outcomes. But even understanding this, even recognizing that he'd failed in ways more profound than simple death, Tom couldn't bring himself to regret the choices that led here. 19 women had escaped, even if most would be recaptured. Anya was free, even if hunted. He'd proven to himself, if not to Thorne, that humans were capable of transcending their worst impulses, even if that transcendence came with costs too high to rationally justify. Sarah appeared in Tom's mind, not memory, but hallucination, born from blood loss and trauma, her face disappointed but not surprised. I told you violence doesn't break cycles, Thomas. It just creates new ones. Tom wanted to argue, to explain that sometimes breaking cycles required people willing to sacrifice themselves, that his actions had mattered, even if the outcomes weren't what he'd hoped. But Sarah was right too, in ways Tom couldn't deny. He'd become. The violence he'd opposed had killed men in service of rescue that hadn't truly freed anyone, had demonstrated principles through actions that contradicted the very values he claimed to uphold. Thorne was speaking again, asking questions Tom didn't have energy to answer, recording responses or non-responses in a leather-bound journal, treating Tom's suffering as material for academic study rather than human experience worthy of empathy. Time became fluid, unmeasurable, Tom drifting in and out of consciousness as his body fought infection and trauma, as Thorne administered enough medical care to keep him alive, but not enough to actually heal. Days passed, maybe weeks, measured not in calendar progression, but in the accumulation of small torments, interrogations about his motivations, drugs that made him speak truths he'd never intended to share, the constant presence of someone who viewed his humanity as an interesting puzzle rather than a sacred reality. Through it all, Tom held on to one thought, one image that Thorne couldn't access or corrupt: Anya climbing out of that barn, leading women towards something that might be freedom or might be just different captivity, but was at least choice, was at least the possibility of something better than what they'd left behind. That possibility, fragile and maybe temporary, was worth what Tom had paid, worth the pain and captivity and the slow erosion of everything that made him himself. Because the alternative, doing nothing, walking away, letting fear and practicality override moral imperative, that would have been true death, the kind that killed your soul long before your body stopped functioning. Tom closed his eyes against Thorne's latest question, retreated into the dark spaces inside himself, where Thorne couldn't follow, and waited for whatever came next. Tom lost count of the days in Thorne's custody. The room where he was kept had no windows, no natural light to mark the passage of time. Only Thorne's visits provided structure, and those came at irregular intervals, designed to disorient, to break down Tom's sense of temporal continuity, to make him dependent on his captor for even basic understanding of whether hours or days had passed. The interrogations followed patterns Tom began to recognize, despite Thorne's attempts at variation. Questions about motivation, about the specific moments when Tom had chosen action over safety, about what Sarah's death had meant and how it had shaped the man who'd freed Anya from chains. Thorne recorded everything in his journal, cross-referenced responses, built elaborate theories about human morality that treated Tom's suffering as laboratory data. Tom answered when he had strength, remained silent when he didn't, refuse to give Thorne the satisfaction of seeing him break completely. It was a small resistance, meaningless in practical terms, but it was all Tom had left, the ability to deny his captor full access to his inner life, to maintain some boundary between observed behavior and private consciousness. His wounds healed slowly, inadequately. Thorne providing enough medical care to prevent death, but not enough to restore function. Tom's leg remained damaged, infection never fully cleared, leaving him weakened and dependent in ways that served Thorne's research interest. The shoulder wound had healed better, but nerve damage left his right arm partially numb, grip strength compromised. Through it all, Tom thought about Anya, about whether she'd made it clear of Kane's territory, whether the other women had survived their escape, whether his sacrifice had purchased anything more than temporary freedom that ended when bounty hunters collected their rewards. He wanted to believe his actions had mattered, had changed trajectories in meaningful ways, but Thorne's constant reminders of systemic forces beyond individual control made hope feel naive. One day Tom thought it was day, but couldn't be certain. The door opened to admit not Thorne but Marcus Kane, his expression carrying anger that hadn't diminished despite whatever time had passed since the barn raid. "Your woman came back." The words took a moment to penetrate Tom's fog of exhaustion and pain. When they did, his heart lurched with fear and desperate hope mixed together. "Inaya?" Kane's smile was cruel, satisfied. "Turned herself in this morning, walked right into my ranch house, said she'd trade herself for your release." Thorne finds it fascinating, thinks it proves some theory about reciprocal altruism. "I just think she's stupid." Tom felt the weight of that decision, understood what it cost Ania to return to captivity voluntarily, to trade freedom, purchased at such high price for his life. The sacrifice was enormous, possibly meaningless, definitely the kind of choice that Thorne would find endlessly interesting as evidence of how humans made irrational decisions based on emotional bonds rather than logical self-interest. "Don't accept. Tell her I'm already dead. Tell her anything, but don't take that trade." Kane laughed, the sound harsh in the small room. "Too late. I already accepted. She's in the barn right now, chained up, same as before, waiting to see if Thorne honors the agreement. Which he will, because he's more interested in watching what happens when she discovers you're broken than in keeping you as a research subject." The door closed, leaving Tom alone with the knowledge that his sacrifice had been undone, that Ania had thrown away freedom to save someone who wasn't worth saving, who couldn't be saved, whose continued existence just created more suffering for people who cared about him. Hours later, or maybe minutes, Eve's time sense was completely unreliable. Thorne appeared, his expression carrying satisfaction that suggested the day's events had confirmed theories he'd been developing. "Fascinating development. She came back for you despite every rational calculation suggesting she shouldn't. The bond formed during trauma is apparently stronger than I estimated, capable of overriding survival instinct in both parties. That's publishable research, Thomas. Your suffering has scientific value." Tom found his voice raw and desperate. "Let her go. You have me. You've proven whatever point you wanted to make. She doesn't need to be part of this." Thorne tilted his head, considering. "But she is part of this. Her choices are as interesting as yours, maybe more so because she has direct experience of what captivity means and chose to return anyway. I need to observe how that decision affects her over time, how guilt and obligation interact with trauma." And the window exploded inward, glass shattering as something heavy crashed through it. Tom's vision swam, couldn't process what was happening fast enough, saw shapes moving with violent purpose, heard gunfire close, and deafening, felt hands grabbing him roughly but not cruelly, dragging him toward the broken window. Fresh air hit Tom's face, cold and shocking, after however long in that closed room. He was being carried, multiple people supporting his weight, moving fast through terrain his eyes couldn't make sense of, in the darkness or dawn, or whatever time it actually was. Voices surrounded him, some familiar and some not, all urgent and focused on movement rather than explanation. They traveled for what felt like hours, Tom drifting in and out of awareness, catching fragments. Ania's voice directing people, someone saying they needed to keep moving, arguments about whether Tom would survive the journey. Eventually, they stopped in a place that smelled like desert sage and cold stone sheltered enough that the wind's bite decreased. Ania's face appeared above him, her expression mixing relief with concern that bordered on terror. Stay with me. We didn't come back just to watch you die. Tom tried to focus to understand what "we" meant, who else was present, how this rescue had been accomplished. His vision cleared, gradually revealed not just Ania, but other women, some he recognized from the barn, others who might have been the ones who'd scattered during the escape. How single-word question all Tom could manage, but Ania understood what he was asking. The women you freed, they didn't just run. Some went back to their communities, brought warriors, people who'd been waiting for a reason to move against Kane's operation, but needed proof it was vulnerable. Your attack showed them it could be done. We came back as a group, hit Thorne's facility, while most of Kane's men were spread across the territory hunting us. Got you and 3 other captives he was keeping for research. Tom absorbed this understanding, slowly dawning that his sacrifice hadn't been undone. It had multiplied, had inspired others to take risks they'd been afraid to take before, had demonstrated that resistance was possible even if success remained uncertain. You shouldn't have come back. Too dangerous, too. Ania pressed her hand over his mouth, cutting off the protest. Don't tell me what I should have done. You made your choice in that barn. I'm making mine now. We're even or we're not, but either way, I'm not leaving you to Thorne's experiments. Tom wanted to argue to explain all the reasons her choice was strategically wrong, but he lacked the strength and increasingly lacked the conviction that he was right. Maybe sacrifice wasn't supposed to be one-directional, wasn't something you perform for others, while denying them the right to do the same for you. Maybe reciprocity was how communities formed, how bonds became something stronger than individual survival instinct. Over the next days, and these were actual days, measured by the sun's passage across the sky, by the return of normal temporal flow, Tom learned the full scope of what had happened during his captivity. The women who'd escaped from Kane's barn had indeed scattered, but not randomly. They'd returned to their communities, told their stories, brought evidence of Kane's operation that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Some communities had sent warriors, men and women trained in combat, who'd been waiting for legitimate cause to attack Kane's organization. Others had sent healers, people like Ania's father had been, who understood how to treat wounds and trauma. A few had sent nothing but information intelligence about Kane's operations and Thorne's research facility that made the rescue possible. Tom's raid on the barn hadn't saved 19 women permanently, but it had saved them long enough to reach communities that could mobilize larger responses. The individual act had become catalyst for collective action, had demonstrated vulnerability that others could exploit, had shifted the calculus from Kane is invulnerable to Kane can be hurt if we're willing to pay the cost. Marshall Collins from Redemption had gotten involved not from sudden moral awakening, but from political pressure that made ignoring Kane's operation more costly than addressing it. With multiple communities demanding action, with evidence of trafficking and torture that couldn't be buried through bribes, Collins had no choice but to actually enforce laws he'd previously ignored. Kane's ranch had been raided 3 days after Tom's rescue. His operation dismantled, his men arrested or scattered. Kane himself had been killed, resisting arrest or executed by warriors who didn't trust territorial justice to actually deliver consequences. Tom never got the full story and wasn't sure it mattered. Thorne had escaped during the chaos, disappeared into the territories with his research journals and his twisted curiosity intact. Some said he'd gone east toward the mining camps. Others claimed he'd headed south into Mexico, and nobody knew for certain. He remained a threat, unpunished for his crimes, but at least temporarily, without the resources or protection to continue experiments on human captives. Tom healed slowly in a camp that moved frequently, staying ahead of any remaining members of Kane's organization who might seek revenge. The communities that had mobilized against Kane provided security, supplies, medical care that was rough but effective. His leg remained damaged, would probably never fully heal, but he could walk with a cane, could move under his own power, even if running was no longer possible. Ania stayed close during his recovery, not from obligation, but from choice. Their bond forged through shared trauma, having evolved into something that looked like friendship, or maybe partnership. She didn't need him anymore, had demonstrated her capability to organize resistance and lead people through danger. But she chose to remain present, to share stories in silence, in equal measure, to be someone who understood what Tom had sacrificed and why. 2 months after the raid on Thorne's facility, Tom stood on a ridge overlooking the valley where his burned cabin had stood. The structure was gone completely, now reclaimed by the land, leaving only a slight depression and some scattered stones to mark where he'd spent 5 years hiding from the world. Anaya stood beside him, following his gaze across familiar terrain. Planning to rebuild, Tom considered the question, tested his feelings about returning to isolation, now that the circumstances that had driven him from it had shifted. No, that cabin was about running away, about protecting myself from the risk of caring about people who I might fail. I don't want to live that way anymore. Anaya nodded, understanding in ways most people wouldn't. So what do you want? Tom thought about Sarah, about the woman she'd been, and the principles she'd taught him about breaking cycles and choosing differently. She'd been right that violence alone didn't solve systemic problems, but wrong that restraint was always the answer. Sometimes change required people willing to act despite knowing the cost, willing to sacrifice. Knowing the sacrifice might be insufficient, willing to choose resistance when surrender would be safer. I want to do what you did. Go to communities that are being targeted by people like Cain, help them organize resistance before victims are created. Can't fight every battle, can't save everyone, but maybe I can help people save themselves. Anya smiled, the expression transforming her face in ways that made Tom remember she was young, had survived horrors that would have destroyed others, had emerged not broken, but tempered into something harder and more resilient. That's going to be dangerous work. People like Cain aren't unique. There are dozens of operations like his across the territories, each one protected by corrupt officials or isolated enough that no one bothers investigating. You'll make enemies, get hurt, probably die before your time. Tom nodded, accepting the reality she was describing. Better than dying slowly of guilt and isolation. Besides, I'll have help. You're coming with me, right? Ania's smile widened. Somebody needs to keep you from getting killed in the first week. Might as well be me. They stood together on the ridge as the sun climbed toward noon. Two damaged people who'd found in each other's brokenness something worth fighting for, looking toward a future that promised hardship and danger, and the possibility of meaningful action in a world that too often rewarded passivity. Tom thought about Sarah one final time, imagined her voice commenting on his plans, on the choices that had led him from isolation to engagement, from running away to moving towards something larger than himself. She would have worried, would have cautioned him about the risks, would have reminded him that violence begat violence, and that cycles were hard to break. But Tom hoped she might also have understood that sometimes the only way to honor people who believed in human decency was to fight for it, to demonstrate through action that nobility existed even when the cost was everything. The past couldn't be changed. Sarah would remain dead, her killers would remain unpunished by the legal system that had failed her. But the future was still unwritten, still contained the possibility that people like Tom and Ania could make it different, could prevent other Sarahs from dying undefended, could build something better from the ruins of what they'd survived. It wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't justice in any pure or complete sense. But it was choice freely made in defiance of systems that wanted people to believe individual action didn't matter. And sometimes choice was enough. Tom turned away from the valley where his old life had burned, took his first steps toward whatever came next, and didn't look back. The innocent should not hang. They should not be chained to fences or locked in barns or treated as property by men who believe power absolved them of moral responsibility. And when law failed to protect them, when systems designed for justice became instruments of oppression, someone had to stand between the vulnerable and those who would exploit vulnerability. Tom had learned this lesson slowly, painfully, at a cost measured in blood and suffering and 5 years of hiding from truth. But he'd learned it, and now finally he was ready to live it. Epilogue. 6 months later, a letter reached Marshall Collins in Redemption, delivered by a trader who'd passed through territory far to the north. Collins opened it with the wariness of someone who'd spent recent months trying to rebuild a reputation damaged by his previous tolerance of Cain's operation. The letter was brief, written in a careful hand that suggested education and attention to detail. Marshall Collins, you should know that the Henshaw operation near Silver Falls has been dismantled. 32 captives, freed ledgers documenting trafficking, routes secured for your records. The Henshaw brothers won't trouble anyone again. There are more operations like theirs. More men like Kane who believe isolation protects them, who think victims are too broken to fight back, who assume good people will do nothing because the cost of action seems too high. They're wrong. Signed, a friend of Justice Collins studied the letter for a long time, noting the location mentioned, calculating distances and timelines, understanding that someone, probably multiple someones, had taken it upon themselves to enforce laws that officials either couldn't or wouldn't uphold. He should probably investigate, maybe try to stop whoever was conducting these vigilante operations before they sparked wider violence or made his job more complicated. Instead, Marshal Collins filed the letter carefully, added it to a growing folder of similar reports from across the territories, and returned to the mundane work of territorial law enforcement. Some wars were better fought by people who'd already sacrificed everything and had nothing left to lose except their humanity. And sometimes the best thing a lawman could do was not interfere when justice found ways to manifest outside official channels. Collins returned to his paperwork, and the frontier continued its slow, brutal evolution towards something that might eventually deserve to be called civilization. Somewhere to the north, Thomas Wade and Inia helped survivors rebuild communities, taught resistance tactics demonstrated through example, that some people still chose differently when given the opportunity. They didn't win every fight. Some operations proved too strong, some rescues failed, some people couldn't be saved no matter how hard others tried. But they kept choosing, kept acting, kept proving through their continued existence that nobility wasn't myth or memory or something that had died with better times. It was alive, difficult, imperfect, and absolutely essential. The chains had fallen from Ania's wrists 6 months ago. The chains of guilt and isolation had fallen from Tom's heart shortly after. What remained was purpose, partnership, and the daily work of building a world where chains became relics instead of tools. It was enough. It had to be.